All right, so I'm Lee Bishop. I'm the designated deputy federal official for the New Mexico Citizens Advisory Board. It's my pleasure to welcome everybody today. A little bit of housekeeping. The restroom facilities are behind the front desk. You go down the hallway and then you turn to the right, and they're there. We do have an exit blocked here because we had to set up the room this way, so the only exit to this room is behind me. And once you get in the hallway, go to the nearest outside exit if for some reason we need to evacuate the building. Look out for everybody, and if you do evacuate, we're going to do that in a very orderly fashion, if we would, please. So with that, a little bit of housekeeping out of the way, Madam Chair, I turn the meeting over to you.
Thank you, Lee, for the information and the introduction. I wanted to thank everybody for being here today. And we did not get a chance to meet in January, so I want to say Happy New Year to everybody. I've been waiting for that. And we are here today in Santa Fe for the March 15th, 2023 Northern New Mexico Citizens Advisory Board meeting. We are happy to have a new member, Stephen McLaughlin, joining us today. And we have another new member who is not able to join us today. His name is Joe Villegas, and he will join us at the next meeting. At this time, I'm going to put you on this spot, Stephen. If you could briefly introduce yourself to the CAB members we have in person and on WebEx.
Like that? All right. Thank you. My wife and I started moving to Santa Fe in 2021. We're still in that process from Texas. My background is commercial real estate law, electrical co-ops, and hydrogen plants, which is an odd mix. And semi-retired and interested in participating. Look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, for the introduction. And we will go around the room, and I would like for all the board members to introduce themselves with your name and where you're from. We'll start with Roger.
Hi, my name's Roger Life, CAB member representing the area of Espanola. I worked at Los Alamos National Laboratory for 12 years and the fire department in Los Alamos for 19 years. Retired. Thank you.
Sterling Grogan, Santa Fe.
Patricia Pacheco, Nambe, New Mexico.
Manny Lesperance, Milwaukee.
Mark Hayden, Santa Fe. I'm the general counsel for the Office of Superintendent Insurance and worked for the state for 10 years.
Jim Murphy, Santa Fe County.
Stuart Barter, I'm a retired architect, live in La Puebla, New Mexico. I'm here to counterbalance Roger and all the Espanola, Milwaukee people.
Thank you. We will now move on to the board members who are joining us through WebEx. Elena, can you start us off?
I can, and then from there I'll go to, if you don't mind, Madam Chair, I'll go to my right who I can see. So I'm Elena. I'm the vice chair of the CAB, and I'm representing Taos. And to my right, I see Marty Hewlett.
Thanks, Elena. Marty Hewlett, in Taos, and I'm a faculty member at UNM Taos. I'll let you call on the next one, Elena.
Thank you. Anne?
Oh, good afternoon. I'm Anne Laurent. I'm the Deputy County Manager for Los Alamos County, and I'm also a resident of Los Alamos County.
Thank you, Anne. Miguel?
Hello, everybody. My name is Miguel Garcia. I'm the Environmental Program Manager for the Taos Pueblo, and live in San Carlos, New Mexico.
Thank you, Miguel. We had a little bit of an audio issue there, so Miguel is representing Taos Pueblo. Thank you. And that's all I can see online from CAB members. Madam Chair?
Thank you, Elena, for the assistance. And should we go around the room here? And I would also like to ask that the visitors we have with us in person, if they could introduce themselves also.
Erich with N3B.
Amanda Audette with N3B.
Sarah Chandler, EMLA.
Okay, thank you everybody for the introductions. Prior to this meeting, Denise and Bridget had prepared meeting packets, which included the agenda and the minutes for the November 15, 2022 meeting. At this time, I'd like to motion to approve, if there are no other changes, to approve the agenda for the March 15th, 2023 Northern New Mexico Citizens Advisory Board meeting.
So moved.
Thank you. May I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? With no opposition, motion carries. Thank you very much. We will now move on to the approval of the minutes for the November 15th, 2022 meeting. If there are no changes or further comments, may I have a motion to approve the minutes for the November 15th, 2022 meeting?
Move approval.
Stuart? No. Sterling? If you, may you please speak your, say your name if you.
Stuart Barter moves approval.
Thank you, Stuart.
Mark Hayden, second.
Thank you, Mark. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Thank you. Motion carries. We will now proceed on to old business with updates from the chair, the vice chair, and subcommittee chairs. From the chair, the only announcement that I have is that next week, Mark Hayden and myself will be attending the chairs meeting in Washington, D.C., and that should be good. We've had Denise and Bridget prepare slides, and we will give updates on what has occurred the past half a year for the Northern New Mexico CAB. And we will also meet with other CAB members throughout the United States, and we will discuss different issues and get updates. And the next fall chairs meeting will occur in Oak Ridge. And at that point, we will more than likely have a new chair. And I just wanted to put it out there that if you have an inkling that you want to be chair, it's very interesting. I enjoy being a chair, meeting and talking with everybody. I swore that I would never be chair when I first became a member, and here I am today. So anything's possible. With that, Vice Chair Elena, do you have any updates?
Madam Chair, no. As Vice Chair right now, I don't have any updates, but I have multiple updates for the subcommittees. Thank you.
Thank you. You may proceed with your subcommittee updates.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, should we let Mark go first so we go in alphabetical order for consent order?
We are currently still on the old business for updates on the subcommittees.
Oh, okay. Well, then I'll go first, then Mark can update the consent order subcommittee after. So the public outreach subcommittee, we had the working group subcommittee meetings in February, on February 15th. And these are the three separate subcommittees, consent order, public outreach, and risk evaluation and management. The public outreach subcommittee met and we held elections. Sherilyn is now the vice chair, and I will return as actual chair. We have a new website for the CAB that's in the works, and Bridget will facilitate that as our program and project manager. I'm excited about our new website. The site will archive our meetings, post agendas, and other documents for us and for the public. And it should be a more a user-friendly website. So we will update you as that comes along. And then when we hold our next subcommittee meeting, I look forward to interacting with our new members. Oh, and also today is our inaugural day, hopefully, for YouTube. I believe we may be broadcasting on YouTube, or at least captured on YouTube, and then put on YouTube later. So if we do go viral, let's let it be for all the right reasons. So that's my update for the public outreach subcommittee. The risk evaluation and management subcommittee meets regularly. And today we're looking forward to the vote from the CAB on the draft recommendation that we've put forward. So that's all I have for those two subcommittees. Mark, would you, Madam Chair, if you don't mind, Mark can give the update on the consent order subcommittee.
Thank you for that, Elena. And Madam Chair, we the consent order committee met and discussed several items. One was brought up at the last general meeting about the risk assessment tool. We would like to find out a little bit more about what is being used by ELMA and how they're using it, because this was another topic of discussion that the Environment Department had brought up, and there was some dispute as to which one was correct or more accurate. There was some cost factors involved. The consent order, Jim, how many pages?
I'm glad you asked. Here's the consent order and the 3 addendums. There's 150 pages here. You want me to go on for a second?
Just want the volume. Yeah.
Okay. We'll come back to it.
All right, so one of the questions that came up, is there a Cliff Notes type version? Is there somebody who can give a presentation, an overview of the consent order, because it's a lot of reading material, and piecing it together and understanding it is rather an art form. Some attorneys might say they master it. I have not. I'd like to see it as well, so that's one thing we'd like to see. And then we wanted an update on the Chrome plume, because that's a moving target. And then we wanted to have our recommendation, consent order committee, subcommittee recommendation approved at this meeting. That's all I have.
Thank you, Mark and Elena, for your update. I also wanted to, before we proceed, to remind everybody joining us by phone or online to make sure that you are muted throughout the meeting. And if there are any questions, raise your hand online. And in person, I forgot to mention to just put your card up if you have any questions throughout the meeting. Thank you. Do we have any other items that we wish to address in old business? If there's no other, we'll move on to new business, consideration action on draft recommendations. And before we begin with that, I wanted to express my gratitude to both Mark and Elena for drafting the recommendations. And in addition, they were meeting and having phone calls and emails and text. And then they were updating, revising, sending it out, getting feedback, updating, revising, editing, sending out. It was a long process. And thank you for being very receptive to all the comments, the wordsmithing. And I'm very grateful for that. I know it was a lot of work, and you took the time out of your very busy schedules to do this work for the CAB. Thank you very much. And so today, what we are going to be doing is we will be taking action on the draft recommendations. At this time, I'm going to ask Mark if you could give us a brief summary of the draft recommendation for the cleanup milestones, targets, and goals under the consent order. Mark, I turn the time over to you.
Thank you for that, Cheryl and Madam Chair. So the recommendation, I'll summarize it from a high level, is that when things are presented on some of the campaigns, they're often technically worded and there's no visuals that go with them. And what this summary recommendation does is put it for the plain person to understand, both pictorially in a graph form, that they could look in a glance and see where you're at, how many years you've been working on each campaign, how long you have until you're at a end state or completed, and how much was spent along the way. Right now, the consent order only allows a year or two in advance before you don't hear anything. And so we'd like to expand the consent order to include a further look down the road. And we understand the further down the road you get, the harder it is to really predict what you're going to see, how you're going to see it, how much it'll cost. But at least have some kind of a projection, as opposed to saying the consent order doesn't allow for it, so we're not going to do it. The other one is to use more language that is pedestrian in the sense that it's not highly technical. You can observe what's being done and understand it, and as I put it, you can explain it to your mother when you get home. That's the goal. So I could go through all the different parts of it if you want, but I think from a high level, it's just making it more simplistic, more informative, and easier to understand, comprehend, and be able to digest it.
Thank you, Mark, for that summary. And if you are in person, it is the pink copy within the packet. And at this time, I'd like to entertain a motion for action on this draft recommendation.
Move approval, 2023-01 recommendation, Stuart Barter.
Thank you, Stuart. Is there a second on the motion?
I'll second. Sterling.
Thank you, Sterling. Is there any discussion? If there's no further discussion, all in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? With no opposed, motion carries. Good job, Mark. We will now move on to the consideration action on draft recommendation 2023-02, chrome plume final remedy and concurrent enhanced monitoring for plume nature and extent. Elena?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't think I could have chosen a shorter title. I think it's pretty much summarized in the title. So we've had extensive briefings on the chromium plume that resides under Morton-Dad Canyon in Los Alamos, and the interim measures that have been used in the past to help either control the plume or chemically amend the plume. However, the one remedy that seems to be the most favored by EMLA and NMED has expressed favor of this remedy, which could possibly, are proposing to be the final remedy, would be the pump and treat plume control treatment or final remedy, which was an interim measure. It has yielded encouraging results for addressing the hexavalent chromium plume via extraction and treatment, and appears to be an agreeable and somewhat favorable interim measure candidate for final remedy, and also by not just NMED, DOE, EMLA, but members of the board and some local stakeholders. So one thing, though, is that we would recommend that NMED and DOE, EMLA do begin negotiations on steps toward a final remedy and exactly where injection would take place, because right now there is some dispute over the injection into the plume or outside of the plume and the hydraulic barriers. So we would encourage negotiation between the parties. Concurrent with the pump and treat final remedy recommendation, we also do recommend that there be an enhanced monitoring system, and this would give more data and help with the nature and extent of the plume. To know more about the nature and extent of the plume, and this would give us better feedback data to help close those data gaps and know that the system is working and how best to continue forward with this final remedy. So that is our recommendation. You've had several months now to read it. It's been wordsmithed just a little bit to make sure that we have terminology correct. Nothing substantial has changed since the initial, excuse me, my internet is telling me it's weak. I hope you can still hear me. Since we initially sent it out to the CAB. So that is what I have, and I'm not sure what color it is in your packet.
Thank you, Lena. Our packet here, it's a golden color, and thank you for the summary of that. And with that, may I have a motion of action for this draft recommendation?
Mark Hayden, move to accept the recommendation.
Thank you, Mark.
Second, Stuart.
Thank you, Stuart. Is there any discussion? Stuart?
I think this is a critical issue. The Risk Committee has spent months talking about this. The position of NMED is incomprehensible to me. I was asked at lunch today if I believe that this injection process to get rid of the treated water is reasonable. I don't know. But in 18 and a half years since the chromium plume was discovered, no other solution has come up that seems to be removing chromium from the plume. The two additive experiments failed. This process is used other places in the country, specifically at other EM sites like Hanover successfully. NMED has presented no scientific information to support their opposition to reinjection of it, whereas apparently EM and N3B have scientific proof that it is, one, not harming or polluting the aquifer and in fact stopping the flow of the plume, if not pushing it back. Someone has not done simple math on the part of EMED. So far, 680 pounds of chromium have been removed from the plume, requiring the extraction, treatment, and injection of 400 million gallons of water. If the same ratio is applied to the remaining 159 plus thousand pounds of chromium, my estimate is that's 94 billion gallons of water to be removed from a regional aquifer and disposed of. The EM's proposal is to put it back into the aquifer after it's been treated. I support that idea. As near as I can tell, NMED's proposal is to pump that water up out of this canyon, across the mesa, and dispose of it in an adjacent canyon. Now, 6 months ago or so, they said, we just don't want you to inject it back into the aquifer. We want to inject it someplace else. Listen to the tape if you don't accept that as rational information. Now, it's my understanding they want to dispose it on the surface. Well, if you had 10 20-inch wells pumping 24 hours a day, they would produce 2.2 million gallons of water daily that is going to be dumped on the surface of an adjoining canyon. Other than the 200 feet plus of head to that water, which turns these into the biggest fire hoses you have ever seen in your life, you know, where is the permit coming from to get 94 billion gallons of water out of a regional aquifer in drought-stricken New Mexico and throwing it away? This goes beyond stupidity. This is utter sheer lunacy. And somehow we can't get EMLA and NMED to agree on whatever it is. Well, as being a great opponent of the production of plutonium pits at LA National Lab, I support NMED's opposition to it. Let's do nothing. Let's let that chromium plume reach the domestic water well Los Alamos, which is currently not being used out of threat of that. And somewhere in less than 20 years, this plume's going to get there. It's going to reach San Ildefonso faster. It's going to go into the Rio Grande, which is a water source for not only Santa Fe County, but Bernardillo. So let's let them succeed, because they will shut down the lab faster than anything else I know, other than a huge plutonium pit explosion up at the lab. So somewhere along the line, there has to be some meeting of minds to come up with a solution that at least works. And again, in 18 and a half years, no other solution has come forward. NNED does not have a solution. They don't have any better idea on how to do this. So, and to end on a positive note, I'm just in awe of the work that Elena has done to prepare this recommendation. You know, she and Mark seem to have a unique ability to put this together. I don't know of anybody else on our committee that could certainly not me, could have written this recommendation untold hours. I'm retired. I just have to take care of 3 cats and horses and whatever, but she's got a job to do, you know, and so I'm in awe, and she's been a real treasure to this board and to our committee. So thank you, Elena.
Thank you, Stuart. Sterling?
Hi. Elena, do you have a sense of how NMED is likely to react to this recommendation?
No, that isn't for me to say. I just know what they have presented publicly to us and what is in the public record. So that is for our constituents and our colleagues in the NMED for them to say.
Yeah. Well, thanks. The only thing that gives me hesitation about this recommendation is, are we in a situation now where there are dueling models of the groundwater behavior at Los Alamos? If so, then I'm going to vote for this recommendation, but I think everybody should be aware of how stupid we will look if it does turn out that all that's going on is arguments between modelers, because modelers don't understand reality for the most part, because they don't have to. They're opposed to reality. And so I'm hesitant, but something needs to be done, as I support Stuart's idea about that. And I would like to also thank Elena for your hard work. This was really great. You did a great job.
Thank you, Sterling. Jim?
Thank you. I agree with everything that's been said so far. I'd like to take it up a notch before we move on. As I said when Mark brought this up, here is the consent decree or consent order, as best I understand it, including the 3 addendums. And when I started pulling this off, Mark and I have had a lot of discussions about this. So when I started pulling this off, I thought, and then here comes the New Mexican with the variety of approaches to this chromium plume idea. And I'd like to at least assess where the committee thinks we are in terms of what our role is in all of this. I'm not a chemical engineer. I'm not a lawyer. I just want to kind of recommend we do something, if possible, to pull the players together and have a forum or a discussion from the various entities. It's a tricky issue, I understand that, because there are a lot of opinions by much smarter people than me. But can we possibly look at our role? Everywhere in here it says our job is to do something that makes the public understand better what's going on. And if we could find a way to do that, either within our meeting context or even a special meeting, I don't know. You guys are the experts in all this. We had a meeting a month ago, I think, wasn't it, Lee, when we were talking about this very thing in terms of trying to condense, for public consumption at least, trying to condense this consent order to a, what I like to call a Cliff Notes version, where it's bullet points, not page after page after page of scientific documentation. You know, I think I could embarrass a lot of you and say, have you read this whole thing? I'm not going to ask that question, but it's daunting. It is absolutely daunting, but it is governing. It's a legal document that's governing all that's going on right now. And let me finish by saying this. I'm kind of a contextual guy. I've been watching this whole thing in the Palestine, Ohio area with the train wreck. And the thing that has really interested me in it is that the people who live there are scared to death about what could possibly be going on in their community. It's not about how many cubic yards of earth that are going to be moved and all that kind of stuff. They want to know if they're going to be safe. They want to know if they can drink the water. Those are the kinds of things that they want to know about. And I think we have some of the same issues here. We can spend a lot of our time collectively with the great support we're getting from Lee and Michael and others in trying to understand the technical issues that we're involved in. But I think if we're going to seriously consider the public and the public's concerns, I think we have almost an afraid group of public people in the whole United States, and I think it focuses here on what's going on. So let me finish with this. If it's possible, Lee said that he would try to find somebody who could condense all this and come and make a presentation, maybe in June or somewhere, where we can really fully understand what's in here, and particularly the addendums. It's awesome. So if we can get something like that going, I certainly want to support. Mark and I have spent hours talking about all this, and Elena has done such a wonderful job of pulling it together from all the work that she has done. And then we have my friend Stuart here, who has an opinion or two. I'd like to get that out in front of us all in terms of, you know, what's going on in the state, for example. They've made a recommendation. They want to stop the whole thing. And then we have the community, and they want to keep it going. So where is the answer? And can we possibly set up a situation in which we can be the vehicle that brings all that to fore without offering up our opinions? I have no idea what's right, but it's in there somewhere. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jim. Michael?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to answer Sterling's question. I'll be talking to I was asked for my remarks to talk about a few subjects. The Chromium interim measure status is one of them. But Sterling, to answer your question, in my discussions with the state and NMED, this is not a case of dueling models. The state does not have a model, and the state does not have calculations.
Thank you, Michael. Mark?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll keep my comments very short. Well, first off, I want to congratulate and applaud Elena. What great work she's done researching it, outlining it, and condensing it to the 4 pages it is. But beyond that, I think the recommendation does a couple things. One, it really identifies the failures of some interim measures, notes that the interim measure in place is in controversy with the New Mexico Environment Department. And then it goes on to say what we recommend happen is that we get a final remedy in place in 2023. And I really applaud that. I think it's a great idea. Let's try something that works. Let's agree on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Roger?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to say a few things just because the total time that I've been with the CAB, this has been one of the premier issues that is being dealt with. And some of the philosophies or thought processes have changed. When I first started hearing about the chromium plume, it was my understanding that it was basically on the surface of the aquifer. In my way of thinking, at the time, if you take a glass of water and you put oil in that glass of water, the oil stays on the surface. My thought process at the time was, if you try and draw water from the surface where the plume is highly concentrated, as opposed to drawing water from the aquifer where there is no plume at the time, might be a solution. But in recent months, there's been a comment about the plume is not staying at the surface of the aquifer. It's, as my understanding, it's migrating down into the aquifer. So, I mean, you know, when the dynamics of the physics of the plume change, then the way that you're going to deal with it's going to probably have to change as well. And so, I mean, I just thought maybe there might be some clarification from what was early talked about as far as the plume being in the surface area in the aquifer, and now more recently that it's at a lower level or it's migrating into the aquifer completely. So that, I just wanted to bring that as something about the history of dealing with this plume.
Thank you, Roger, for your comment. We have Rick Shane online who would be able to address some of these concerns. And it is a really broad topic. I believe we could discuss for days on just the different physical, chemical, social, economic impacts of this. But we have Rick who would like to address this briefly.
So Rick, before you start, Rick, just if you could give us a little bit of your background and your new position with the state so everybody understands who's speaking.
Surely. This is Rick Sheen. I'm formerly the Hazardous Waste Bureau Chief at NMED and now currently the Resource Protection Division Director. My background has been hydrogeology, environmental cleanups over the years, also water rights management, and other environmental mitigation and remediation project activities, as well as monitoring. I do want to speak to sort of three main points I've heard during the concerns expressed during the meeting. One, NMED has agreed that pump and treat is good, but what the interim measure is here right now is pump and treat plus injection to create a wall barrier. Our disagreement with LANL at this point is that we don't agree that the data that we see is actually creating a barrier. We see it more as the fresh water being pushed on top where, again, we don't believe that they're at the edge of the plume. It's actually water's pushing down the edge and mixing slightly. And as just was noted recently, yeah, we're starting to see the plume even further down. Two, as far as the waste of water, when we were saying that we wanted to stop, it certainly wasn't a permanent measure. As I said, we like the pump and treat. We like them extracting the mass and cleaning it and putting the water back in the ground. I would definitely prefer that over the long term, but I don't think they have the infrastructure in place that they probably would have for a final remedy in order to do that. So this is our disagreement with them on the technical basis of what they say they're seeing and their model is displaying is not based on our wish that they stop pump and treat. We agree totally with the early sentiment that previous two attempts to do anything were unsuccessful, and this one is. Pump and treat is very common around the country to deal with these dissolved phase contaminants. That's how chromium works when it mixes with groundwater. Also, I would echo what I heard earlier about models. I don't like to get into dueling models. One, NMED doesn't have the money to spend millions of dollars creating code just to compete with someone else and not working together on what the same assumptions are. The model that I can't say for myself in my history here that the model's been fully vetted by NMED, but at the same time, we're just dealing with a black box. We don't agree with everything of all the data that's filling the model. But again, we're not going to do our own. We're just going to look at the results. And that's what the data is showing us. So we do have a difference of opinion on what the data is saying, but we both would point to the same data to defend our positions. So I just wanted to address that right up front, because I think there's a little bit of sort of a misrepresentation, or at least a misunderstanding of what NMED's position is. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Rick, for the clarification, and thank you for the discussion. Moving forward, there's a lot of work we have for us. And with that, can all those in favor of approving the draft recommendation say aye?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And with that, motion carries. Thank you, Mark and Elena, for the excellent work. We will now move on to the next item. Oh, before we begin, we have two board members that have joined us. We have Melissa Casillas out of Taos.
I'm here.
Okay, and then we also have,
Where are you, Melissa?
oh, Melissa, did you want to just introduce yourself briefly?
I am having issues with my computer, so I'm sorry my video isn't working, but I'm Melissa Casillas and I'm from Taos, New Mexico. I've been a member since April, so nice to meet everybody. And sorry I was late today.
Thank you. And do we have Rafaela online also?
Yes, I am here.
Can you also briefly introduce yourself?
I am Rafaela Sanchez. I am from the Pueblo of Powahkia.
Thank you. We will now move on to the next item. Update from EMLA Field Office, Michael Michelanis. Michael, I turn the time over to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Going to do something a little bit different today. Normally, I would also include in my update a little bit of what's going on with the site, some of the operations and things that are going, but I'm going to leave that to my corporate partners for theirs, because I received a request to cover 3 topics today: the Chromium intermeasure and where we're going, the status of the Justice 40 pilot, and our strategic vision. So let me kind of dive into that without any further ado. But before I'd like to address Roger, you brought up a point before I get in too much into where we're going from the working through the regulatory direction. I wish the chromium plume was as simple as the oil and water example. That's a great illustration, I think, of the point. The difference, to get a little science into this, oil and water don't mix, but chromium is soluble in the water. So oil will tend to float up. In fact, I'm glad it's not oil, because that's the type of material that would then adhere to the sediments in the ground and be a lot harder to extract out of there. If there's a silver lining in the chromium bad situation, it's the fact that we only have to get it out of the water, and it's just more of a dilution kind of thing as we pump it out and treat it, and what's remaining mixes with the water that comes up gradient into the plume itself. Probably a good analogy that would be an example if you were to drop a blob of food coloring, let's say, into a stream up at the very top and watched it as it goes down. It'll stay kind of a blob as it moves. Now, granted, a river or creek runs a lot faster than groundwater. Put that in slow motion. That blob kind of stays together, but will slowly expand in the horizontal and vertical direction to something called Brownian diffusion. That's just random diffusion as the coloring would mix in it. The coloring would be the chromium, for example, and as that plume moves down with the gradient of the river, it'll move a little bit deeper, but that's not what's causing the deeper indications that we're seeing, and that's a discussion for another day. But Roger, I'd want to put a little science into your discussion, but you're absolutely right. We are focusing on the upper part of the aquifer, but we realize and understand that the operation of the intermeasure will have effects. If you try to dam up the plume and contain it on lab property, water has to go somewhere. So it's either going to go over into San Ildefonso and parts east if we don't try to contain it. But if we do contain it, it's still going to go somewhere. The irreparable harm, the aquifer occurred the day that it was, without understanding the impacts of chromium in the environment, released out of the steam plants. So now it's just a matter of where do you want the irreparable harm to be, on lab property or somewhere else? So let me dive into where we are with the directive, the regulatory directives that we've had from the state on the interim measures. As Rick mentioned, I would endorse that we, NMED and DOE, both have differing opinions, differing professional opinions about the chromium interim measure operations and the effect they're having on the aquifer. And while I will not ever speak for the regulator, I will convey my understanding from discussions with them, but I will not speak for the regulator. I am confident, however, in those discussions that both agencies have a primary interest in protecting the health of the environment as well as the natural resources of the Pueblo de San Ildefonso. Just to bring you a little bit of history, recently in November and December, we received two separate regulatory directions from the New Mexico Environment Department. In November, we received an email direction from a supervisor in the Hazardous Waste Bureau that directed EMLA to leave certain injection and certain extraction wells, 3 injection and 3 extraction wells, offline. They were, at the time, offline for corrective maintenance, and they directed us not to restart those wells until further notice. NMED, Hazardous Waste Bureau, has not provided specific conditions for resuming the operation of these wells, but you just heard Rick Sheehan does not expect them to. This was not intended to be a long-term situation, but we do not have an end state that we're driving to from that particular piece of regulatory direction. On December 12th, we received a letter from NMED's Groundwater Quality Bureau response to the notice of violation. We've talked to the CAB about that in the past. The notice of violation requested a action plan. The state reviewed the action plan, and in their response to the action plan, which they agreed with, they also added a stipulation or a direction that we complete the action plan and demonstrate to the state's satisfaction through calculations, modeling, qualitative discussions. There were a number of things laid out in the letter. That the operation of the intermeasure will not have adverse impacts on the aquifer, or else we have to cease injection by April 1st. Well, that was they could have just written cease injections until April 1st, because the action plan that we submitted to them included drilling a new well, which could not be completed by April 1st. So we are working with the state on that to address their issues, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few moments. Regarding these two pieces of regulatory direction, we, the EMLA, are concerned that there might be significant adverse impacts over time to the chromium plume if the injection wells remain offline, and that the plume is going to head back to San Ildefonso and continue migrating eastward. The bulk of the plume was being held, the centroid, in higher concentrations back by the hydraulic wall. That's what our modeling shows us. That's what our calculation shows us. That's what our data shows us as well. It's not as simple as, I wish this was a very simple thing to work through. There's, as you alluded to earlier, I do not want to get into a case of dueling modelers, because models can be, depending upon how you put inputs and parameters, models can give you a variety of results. And in fact, when my corporate partners produce a model, it's a number of different runs that you have to look at all these. It's like running the same problem with some variables, 600 times, and you see where the solutions start to converge is what most likely is what in reality is happening. So we don't have a model at this point in time that tells me, okay, so what happens with this thing turning off? And as we work with the state, one of the things that I've been asked in many forums, so what are you going to do come April 1st? My answer to that is we're going to turn it off. I've got direction from my regulator, and unless I want to be litigious, which I do not, or wear an orange jumpsuit, and I do not look good in orange, I'm going to follow the regulatory direction. But in the meantime, we're working with our regulators to help them understand what we do have. And before I use rights or privileges, if you will, that we have under the consent order to go into dispute resolution, before I evoke that, I've been trying to, one of the things during my tenure here at the field office has been to build a more collaborative and constructive relationship with my regulator. I met with them early on and understand what their issues are with the Department of Energy historically, and we've been making, I think, significant strides from my perspective in doing that. And entering into a consent order, dispute resolution, or litigation over this regulatory direction would not be conducive to continuing to try to build that relationship to where we want it to be. However, but before, I do still have that right or that privilege, if you will, under the consent order, but just because I can doesn't mean I should, as I just explained. So we have our modelers working on if you will, an alternative case of starting today. If I just turn off all injection, what happens in 3, 6, 9, 12 months, to give me a sense of, okay, when do the bad things start happening? Give me a sense. I might have to run it longer than that, but in the near term, just as I work through this regulatory issue and how we respond and how I engage with the Pueblo, et cetera, we've asked our modelers to tell us, given our best tool, what will likely happen as a result of that. Because, you know, if there were negative effects, but they aren't seen for quite some time, that gives me a lot more time to work with the state to see what we can do, what we can work toward, much like what Rick was saying. He didn't want it to be a long-term solution, so maybe that would give me the time. The concern I'm having, though, is the longer I leave it off, it took us, well, we started the interim measure in 2018, 2019, and now we are here 4 or 5 years later. I pushed the plume back by our model 500 feet. The groundwater moves about 125 feet, plus or minus 20 feet or so a year. You do the simple math. If I turn it off, the plume, in whatever condition it's in now, starts moving back again, and I start eating up that 500-foot buffer, and I'm going to need some of that buffer, because suppose the state had never told us to cease injection and we'd continue working. When we do put a remedy in place, I'm going to have to turn the interim measure off for some time, because I'm going to have to, when I start drilling new wells, I can still run the interim measure, but then when I start redoing the plumbing and repiping things and connecting, I may be reusing portions of the interim measure in different ways than they are now. And you can imagine I'm going to have to unplug certain wells, extraction or injection, and convert them to the opposite of what they were doing, or what have you. And I might have to have the interim measure off for 6 or 8 months or a year to just make those changes as I'm laying the piping and so forth to make these connections. I want that 500-foot buffer or more between where our data and our model tells us the plume currently resides and the boundary to San Ildefonso's Pueblo, so that I don't have the plume creeping up. I can actually predict where the plume might go, so that I'm syncing the final remedy ahead of that as I'm making the connections, because you don't sync the final remedy where the plume is today. You got to account for where it's moving in the future. And I really don't want to eat up that 500-foot boundary. But until I run this model, I'm not in a position I don't want to be an alarmist and say the sky is falling, because we turned the plume, we had to turn the interim measure off during COVID, and that was off for 3 or 4 months, and the world didn't end. The plume didn't move over into San Ildefonso land. So if the Department of Energy were to act hastily or precipitously on this, we wouldn't be serving the taxpayers very well. I wouldn't be treating my regulator as with the appropriate respect that the regulator deserves. And we need to, if we're going to engage in conflict or differences of opinion, professional opinion, I want to bring the best technical basis before I escalate into more formal dispute resolutions. Right now, we're working collaboratively with the state, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And I do want to make one additional point. I think Rick made it in his comments, but I'll elaborate on it, because Neelam made this comment in one of our EM cleanup forums. I want to note the state did not tell us to turn off the interim measure, and they didn't tell us they're opposed to injection. What they told us was that they were opposed to injection in the plume. Unfortunately, I have no other source of injection, and injection is not something injection capability is not something I can put in within a year. So I'm very appreciative of the fact that the state told me injection is not off the table, because that will probably be part of the final remedy if pump and treat is the remedy. And I want to caveat my words here carefully because I can get myself in trouble in RCRA space and NEPA space if I appear to be telegraphing a decision by the Department of Energy on a remedy in advance of NEPA and in advance of RCRA. The state determines the final remedy. I would imagine, and as Rick mentioned, the value of pump and treat, I imagine pump and treat will be one of the remedies proposed in what we call our corrective measures evaluation, which is how we submit a proposed remedy or a series of remedies for the state to consider, and we recommend one of the suite that we evaluate. I do not want to come, I want to make sure everybody here at the table and the public that's listening, any comments I make about pump and treat, et cetera, do not, this is one of many remedies or versions or alternatives that we will address through RCRA, and we will have to make sure that we have NEPA coverage for it. So there, if my lawyer was on, he would tell me, good job, I've done the things to keep myself out of RCRA jail and NEPA jail, if you will. And I don't literally mean jail in those cases. So, well, the state is supportive of injection. That is more helpful at this point, speaking from the owner and the designer, in how we would design a pump and treat system if pump and treat were part of it, because we could inject it into the plume, but much, much, much deeper, say 600 feet deeper, where absolutely no hydraulic effects could affect it. We could do it downstream where we think it is. We could pump it to the left or right or where the plume gradient is. We could pump it to where we think it's upstream. We don't know too much about that. Probably the only thing that we would know more quickly is the depth of it, and we're getting additional characterization data for that. But there's a number of remedies, a number of different ways you can get rid of the water if you inject it, and that's non-consumptive and probably the cleanest, I don't mean in an environmental sense, but probably the simplest way to address the issue, because as I share with you a little about what we considered as alternatives to pump and to injection as a result of this direction, I'll tell you some of the impacts of that and the feasibility of that. So let me talk about the alternatives to injection. Land application probably is the one that I can talk about the most, but let me tell you about another one we considered. It would also fall into the context of land injection, but not what we've talked about so far. We also looked at the feasibility of pumping it out and pumping out and extraction and putting it through the treatment system like normal, but then instead of spraying it on the trees or flat places that our discharge permits allow, let's put it in tanker trucks and pull it all out. What's the feasibility of tanking it out, if you will? Well, last year, and I just did some simple math, and pretty soon this became not feasible. Last year, we pumped out 106 million gallons from the aquifer for treatment, and out of that, we extracted about a little over 150 pounds of chromium. If we were to try to do that in tankers, many of you have taken the tour, new members of the CAB, we'll have an opportunity to visit the site in Mortendad Canyon to see it. But if you've been down to Mortendad Canyon, you know that there's only one road in and out. It's a single road, and it's a bit of a winding road cut through the tuff down into the valley floor. You're not going to get a big tanker truck down there. You're not going to get a semi-tractor trailer kind of tanker up there. So I looked at a medium-duty tanker truck. That's about 2,000 gallons. Well, if you divide 106 million gallons by 2,000-gallon tanker trucks, you're talking 50,000 trucks a year going up and down that single road into the canyon. Can't do that safely. And even a fraction of that, when you do the math and take it down from 50,000, you're talking about little 4,300 trucks a month, and that's assuming you're trucking it up and down the weekends too. That would not be a safe thing to go do, and I don't know where you would where it would actually be safe and feasible, but it's probably such a low percentage of what the injection is capable of. We didn't spend a lot of time exploring that option, but we have explored another alternative to land application, which is following what's in the discharge permit. The discharge permit that we have with NNMCAB allows us to apply what's extracted to the land, but there are some significant limitations on that and some concerns that would have. If we were just to simply extract and then land apply, the hydraulic barrier is gone. And the hydraulic barrier was an essential part of what's in the consent order. If you go back to the consent order in Appendix C, where it talks about the different campaigns, it talks about the Chromium campaign. It lists 3 objectives for the first Chromium campaign, and the interim measures primary objective is to contain the plume on lab property while you do the characterization that's needed for our final remedy and put together the corrective measures evaluation, or CME, for submittal to the regulator. When we crafted the current approach with the interim measure, and it was worked with NMED, the hydraulic barrier was the thing that we were going to do to contain the plume. Pump and treat extraction of chromium from that is just a secondary benefit, but was not the primary purpose of it. I'm really glad to extract every pound that we can, but the concern that the Department of Energy has is that with the injection part gone, the hydraulic barriers is no longer there, and the only thing you have then containing the plume is what you can extract. And if all the wells, the extraction wells, are spaced so that each well is talking to each other, you could imagine them as let's say an NFL offensive line. They're shoulder to shoulder, elbow to elbow, and they can block the defense from coming through. But if the wells aren't spaced hydraulically so that they effectively vacuum in all the incoming up gradient part of the plume they'll collect some of it, but then other parts of the plume are going to stream by, just like the games that you might play with flag football, where you got one or two people left protecting the quarterback and everybody's running downfield for the pass. The defensive line is going to get through and go downstream a little farther. So we're a little concerned that the extraction wells that we currently have aren't. It's both a matter of the spacing and how much we can operate it. We looked at what percentage of the 106 million could I continue to extract with land application, and with the limitations in the permit, and some of the more significant restrictions are that we're only permitted to discharge into certain areas of the canyon. They need to be flat, and you can't have pooling. So as you discharge that volume of water, you can't pool. You can't apply it under freezing conditions. You can't apply it during rainfall, and you can only land apply for 10 hours a day. When you do the math of all that, and also we can currently pump and treat with the existing system 24/7. It can be done remotely. Land application won't happen 24/7. My contractor works 4/10s. That we would be working that 4 days a week. So now you're losing part of the week to be able to do it. We estimate we could probably extract, if we were able to do land application, it would be about 10 to 15% of the current capacity with injection and extraction combined. So now instead of pumping and re-injecting 106 million gallons and treating that 106 million gallons as a secondary benefit of the interim measure, we're only going to be able to do somewhere between 10 to 15 million gallons. And where we removed about 150 pounds of chromium last year, it'd be somewhere around 15 to 20 pounds of chromium. Again, the chromium removal of the interim measure is a secondary benefit, and frankly, I'm happy to remove every pound I can as we do the interim measure and move to final remedy. But it's the hydraulic control of the plume. I do not want that plume moving and meandering back down to the boundary of San Ildefonso's Pueblo, and I want to contain it. And this interim measure was only intended or envisioned when my predecessors crafted it for a short time. 3 years, I think, is what the consent order says. Now, that was just an estimate. That's what the folks were thinking. Reality is it takes a whole lot longer to get the data that we need to design the system. But this is not intended to be a long-term hydraulic control, because if any of you ever played in the streets when you were a kid in a rainfall, I remember going out at their water, after the rain stopped, the water would keep going down the gutters of the street. And as a kid, I used to take the leaves and the mulch and stuff like that and try to dam it up and put my hands in there. And you can build a little bit of dam there for a while, but eventually, no matter how hard you tried, or I tried, the water's going to run around and find another way down gradient. In this case, it's not gravity, but it's a hydraulic gradient, a difference in the water height that's making the water move. But no matter how much of a hydraulic barrier we put, unless I keep building it out farther and farther and trying to build a bigger and bigger dam, eventually it's going to find a way to move around it, down it, or et cetera. So there's a bias on my part for action and moving to remedy as soon as possible. And the state worked with us last year. I was very appreciative to Rick and Neelam for their efforts to work with us to build a work plan that defined the data gaps that were missing, so that we could for proposing a final remedy, we'd have every single well, every single hole I punch into the earth to go grab water and data is grabbing as much data as possible, focused on getting to the final remedy. Regarding the feasibility of the land application, there's two regulatory hurdles that we have to jump through. The first is working with the Office of the State Engineer. The state engineer regulates the water usage in the state. Our current permit with the state is a non-consumptive permit, which means when we take water out of the aquifer, we're putting it back in the aquifer. If we were to shift the land application, I'm going to need a consumptive permit, and the permitting process in a change like this, even if we do it on an emergency basis, takes many, many months to move through the state engineer's office, even when they're making it a priority, and we believe they will make it a priority. So that's not going to happen before April 1st, and unless I can convince the state of the merits of our model and what we're doing and how it explains the conditions their SMEs are seeing in the data, how they interpret the data, then if I can't convince them of that, then we're going to have to shut down the interim measure as a whole, because I won't have injection land application from the state engineer. We are pursuing that in parallel with discussions with the NMED on the model and alternatives for how the interim measure could be operated. There's a second hurdle in the fact that we get our water from our water rights, if you will, from the county. So they have those, and if we shift from non-consumptive to consumptive, that's gonna be an impact on. They're the ones that plan for how the water is used and dispersed for the county for both current use and growth as well. We've had discussions with the county on this particular issue, and we're hopeful we can work our way through that as well. So in parallel with working with the state to demonstrate, here's what our model is telling us. The state has told us in many public forums that the NMED does not make regulatory decisions based on models, and I can appreciate that fact. But the Department of Energy does use the model as a basis for how we operate the intermeasure. If we were to change it or do something different, we'd go back to our model to say, okay, so what happens if I operate this well like a little differently, or that one in alternative scenarios? We would base how we operate the intermeasure on the model. Now, I'll tell you, I do not take anything that I'm saying or any subject matter expert that comes here says the models are 100% accurate. The models are as accurate as the data that we have. And we have years of data, but if I had my wish and my will, we'd have a lot more geographical locations, but that's a very difficult piece of land to go drill holes in. There are the topography, the sheer walls and rocks are not very conducive to it, and the canyon has many sites that are culturally or that are either cultural significance or sacred to the pueblos around us, and we have to be mindful of that. And I do not drill or disturb those areas. And furthermore, the more activity we do in that canyon, the more noise, the more lights, the more disturbance of the ground. It's disruptive to the plants in the area as well as the animals and how they migrate, which the pueblo depends upon for their lifestyle. So minimal disturbance, minimal activity in the canyon is preferable to not impacting the sovereign nation that directly has a boundary with the national lab. And so these things really limit the geographical data I have. But with the data that we have, our model and our calculations that support and go into it, and we calibrate the model over time, are the best understanding we have. The hope, and we've had discussions with NMED on our model in the past, but one thing we haven't had is we began, when I first arrived here, we had discussions with them, and the state had some issues with the model. But one thing that we've done that we have not shared with the state is we've calibrated our model last year. We calibrated to a lot of the newer data, and when we calibrated to the data that we have, it started to explain why, as Rick said, there's indications in one of the wells that the plume has been pushed a little bit deeper, and we have another well that's showing a rising trend where earlier versions of the model didn't show that. But as we calibrate it with more data and more information, and as every year goes by and we get more data year by year as how things are changing in each of the established wells, and we put new wells in, we get a better and better understanding, and the model refines. So what I tell you, if I were to show you exactly what my models had today, and we fast forward to 2 years in the future, I'll tell you the results would be different. Would they be substantively different? Beats me. But we continue to feed these things, and I sensed that there was an opportunity, and that's why we're engaging with NMED to explain our models to them so that they can see what we did and calibrate it. And I'm hopeful, optimistic even, that when we explain what we have and the basis for it and how we've gotten there, that we'll be able to find a way forward. If there are things that the Department of Energy has to do to improve the data that we have or to gather future data differently, that's all on the table. I come to the table to work with my regulator to find ways to move forward, to improve the data, and hopefully persuade them a little bit of the value and the benefit of all the technical calculations, the analysis, that went into the model and what the model is telling us, not just purely the data itself. You can draw conclusions from the data itself, but I'm hoping to persuade them of the merits of that. So let me shift for a moment to Pueblo de San Ildefonso. The Department of Energy, well, actually the country has laws that direct federal agencies to consult with tribal nations. In this case, the Pueblos. Before we make decisions, the Department of Energy has directives. That's direction to the federal employees. That sets an expectation on how to go do that. And we are engaging with the Pueblo de San Ildefonso throughout this process. I was not aware, and the state is under absolutely no obligation to give me advance notice of regulatory direction. But in this case, I did not have any forewarning of the direction coming through, and so we engaged, if you will, retroactively with the Pueblo of here's the direction we have, and before I started making decisions on different paths and how we would approach it, we shared that information with the Pueblo. We shared our data. Now, granted, I'm not asking the Pueblo to be my scientist or to clean this up for me, but since they're a sovereign nation, we shared as much of the data as they wanted. We shared what our models were telling us. We shared a little bit about the calculations, the groundwater mapping, capture radius calculations, things like that go into the model, things that we could still go off and do, like aquifer testing, to give the Pueblo the best understanding understanding of the best understanding we have and how we got there. I've made just what what I cautioned all of you, that don't take the model as gospel, that this is a perfect picture of what's happening 1,000 feet under the surface of the canyon, but rather I think they understand from the dialogue I've had with them that this is the best understanding that we currently have, and we're making the best decisions we can for containing the plume and protecting the boundary to San Ildefonso as we can. Those discussions have been very productive, and both EMLA and New Mexico's Environment Department support this collaborative effort with the Pueblo. And in fact, we're meeting with them next week, all three parties, NMED, DOE, and the New Mexico Environment Department. We're bringing both the Hazardous Waste Bureau and the Groundwater Quality Bureau to the table to discuss the situation, and we put together essentially a 5-year analysis of how the intermeasure has been working. It uses our model and our understanding how we got there, and some alternatives to how we operated the intermeasure that we might consider. Again, trying to find that consensus position that's still protective of the Pueblo, would still use the hydraulic barrier. But it's up to the state to decide whether they'll allow me to continue to use a hydraulic barrier approach or whether they'll continue to unilaterally direct, no, the hydraulic barrier is not going to work, and is not going to be considered to work any further. But we'll have that discussion. And we're also bringing, since the Office of State Engineer plays a huge role in how we do this, although NMED regulates the discharge permit and they're the primary party under the consent order for the end states and the cleanups, we rely on the Office of the State Engineer to get our drilling permits, and they're heavily involved in how we drill wells and move forward, and what that moving forward looks like. So we've worked with NMED to see if they were supportive of bringing the state engineer to the table as well, and now we're bringing both agencies and the two-part of NMED to the table to have that dialogue with the Pueblo. I read in the New Mexican that the governor of San Ildefonso suggested that all three parties ought to be in the room to discuss the issues and how to move forward, and And I think NMED and the Department of Energy are listening to that, and we're having that meeting on Monday. My personal goal is to achieve, I'm hoping that by explaining our data, that we'll be able to instill some confidence and address maybe some of the lingering issues that NMED might have. And I don't want to sound too optimistic here, but I'm by nature actually a pessimist. And if I just go to my natural pessimistic ways, I'll be sitting in a corner sucking my thumb, bemoaning myself. I want to be optimistic and bring our best case forward. I'm hopeful that when we can instill some confidence or enough in NMED to allow them to let us move forward in trying to find a path that addresses some of their issues while still maintaining that hydraulic barrier. But another end result, another goal of this is I'm hoping to improve or achieve better coordination between DOE, our state regulators, and a more holistic management of the interim measures operation, including both extraction and injection processes. Because as I outlined it before, and I don't know to what extent the state looked at the impacts of the alternatives of land application, by bringing this information and how we got it to the table. We've explained this to the Pueblo, but NMED wasn't present during those discussions. By bringing all the parties together and exploring the options, and frankly, giving the state, the Pueblo and the state engineer, an opportunity to question us. Well, did you consider this or this? That's how you start building some confidence. That's how you start building some trust. That's why I'm optimistic, hopeful. Pick the adjective or adverb of your choice. That we'll be able to maybe find a way forward in this. But I'm hopeful that if we have that give and take and that constructive discussion, that we'll be able to move forward to something. Let me move on to the Justice 40 talking points. And I know, Madam Chair, I'm probably running a little bit late, but there's a lot to unpack in all of this that's going on. And I'm more than happy to answer questions throughout the day. I'm not going anywhere. I'd like to give you an update on where we are with our Justice 40 initiative. So I'm segueing out of the Chromium. I think we've talked enough about Chromium for the moment until you have any specific questions. Let me a little bit of a history. When I first arrived here, I learned that in July, the President announced the Justice 40 initiative, and EMLA was selected as one of the 5 pilot programs within the Department of Energy. We launched into an engagement, a set of listening sessions in January 22, and we're continuing with those listening sessions. The Office of Management and Budget deliverables, part of the Justice 40 was to complete some work and give them our deliverables. We did that at the end of 2021, and we continue to engage in listening sessions and talk to folks about what environmental justice is, what are some of the opportunities, what are they thinking of. We learned early on in these engagement sessions, so what are you going to do differently? Part of it is reaching out and listening, and the other part is when we hear some of that, hear some of the things that are going on and hear some of the needs, we can, whether I've got the government-wide direction from the Office of Management Budget yet, there are some things that we can still work on, and we'll build that into whatever final direction comes out of the Office of Management Budget for the President. I want to give you a couple examples of what we've done differently and what we've heard from some of these listening sessions. One of the things we approached differently was our Los Alamos Pueblos project agreements with the 4 core Pueblos. Through meetings with the Pueblo leaders and their environmental resource departments, we learned that there were opportunities under our current grant to build capacity at the Pueblos for more environmental sampling and monitoring. We also learned that the core Pueblos could use more support for their participation as trustees in the natural resource damage assessment process. We're exploring those opportunities for this with the core Pueblos, and we revised our cooperative agreement, the LAP agreement, if you will, the Los Alamos Pueblo project, to address some of those needs that we heard and expressed. And I'm really pleased to say that we were able to deliver some additional resources and support to the Pueblos in response to those engagement sessions. We're also supporting a new initiative with the University of New Mexico, the TALS Hub of internet-based education. It's called the TALS Hive, for workforce development in northern New Mexico through coaching and mentorship for digital jobs in historically underserved communities. I had the opportunity to visit the Taos Hive and meet with their director and walk through and look at the capabilities and what they're delivering. And I'll tell you, it's an honor to be a part of to be able to support a group who is trying to deliver these services to the underserved communities in northern New Mexico. We're also working with the Santa Fe Indian School under its current grant to support the school's building and launch of a Community Studies Institute for graduate cohorts. And we also hosted tours of the legacy waste cleanup for some of the Santa Fe Indian School students this past fall, and we're looking into more internship opportunities for students at that school. I had an opportunity to visit that school twice, once when EM1 visited and a second time when EM3 visited, and I was just impressed by some of the capabilities that school is teaching its students. There are some things that I saw there that I would have been surprised to see in an undergraduate college program, let alone a graduate college program. So some amazing things they're doing in the Santa Fe Indian School. Shifting back a little bit to the mechanics of the Justice 40 initiative and getting the direction from OMB for government-wide moving forward. This last December, the Council on Environmental Quality, CEQ, I might slip into the acronym, issued an updated climate and economic justice screening tool. This is the tool that you use to screen. It takes demographic and economic data from across the country, puts it in a screening tool, and it helps us as we do the Justice 40 identify those disadvantaged communities as we go back to ensure that at least 40% of certain federal funds are directed to these disadvantaged communities. This tool helps us identify it. We had an opportunity to beta test the tool and provided our input. There were in the original beta version of it, we noted that there were some of the things that were missing. So the final version has some significant updates. It added tribal nations, federally recognized the tribes and locations of Alaska villages as disadvantaged communities. So there was an effort made to upgrade that screening tool to make sure that the tribal nations were appropriately recognized as disadvantaged communities and potential recipients to be considered as we reach the 40% metric the president has set. And there were a number of other enhancements made to the tool that if anybody wants to know a little bit more about, I'd be happy to share offline with y'all. So to kind of wrap up the Justice 40 part, we're still awaiting guidance from the OMB on the benefits calculation methodology and how we'll measure performance in delivering that 40% of certain federal investments to the disadvantaged communities. I can't give you any insights as to what OMB is working through, but I'll tell you what, I would not want to be in OMB's position of trying to figure out how to come up with a government-wide set of guidance that kind of integrates a project kind of approach that I have with a cleanup project here in Los Alamos to nationwide programs that the transportation agencies or the Nuclear Regulatory Commission or any other agency that deals with nationwide programs that aren't just centrally located in a particular area. The Justice 40 is easy to wrap my brain around when you look at it at a project and geographically centered part. I can only imagine the difficulty and the challenges that OMB is having. So not surprised that it's taking some time to roll that out, but we're not sitting on our heels waiting, twiddling our thumbs on it. I think this opportunity while they're working on the nationwide, government-wide guidance gives us a great opportunity to continue those listening sessions, reach out to groups that will engage with us and then listen. And this is a good segue into the strategic vision. As we engage with these folks, I will engage with every non-governmental organization, the public, a group that has an interest in this. I kid with folks that if there's a car driving through Los Alamos or if I'm in Santa Fe that stops at a stoplight too long or a stop sign too long with their window down, I'm going to walk up and have a conversation with them about it and invite them to the strategic vision engagement if they would do that. All joking aside, not everybody that we will reach out and connect with will want to engage with us, and I completely understand that. There can be a number of different reasons for that, but as I transition into the strategic vision discussions, I want to make sure that every group that we want, and we identified a number of groups, non-governmental organizations, elected officials, regulators, et cetera, every group has an opportunity to understand that we're interested in doing this, and they get an opportunity to contribute to this. If they don't want to do that, I absolutely will respect that. And because, it's not my job nor my mandate to force people to come to the table to tell me what they think. But it is my mandate and it is my expectation to seek out engagement with a broad spectrum of folks for the strategic vision, not just my cheerleaders, not just, that mean by that people that support what the department's doing, not just the regulators, not just the elected officials, but to try to engage with a broad spectrum of folks, including the mom and pops across the dinner table. So let me talk a little bit about our strategic vision. I'd like to thank all of you who participated in the October beta test. The sessions that we had in Taos, your input and feedback, and if you will, the dress rehearsal for how we're doing it was extremely helpful in laying the foundation for how we will conduct the phase 1 and 2 sessions for all the groups that I just spoke to. We've had a number of phase 1 and phase 2 engagements. I've been in almost all of those. And I'll tell you, from my perspective, it's going really well. Folks are drinking up and actively engaged in the phase 1 where we're sharing information, informing folks. And in phase 2, we're getting a lot of great feedback. I sit and listen to some of the different World Cafe table discussions, and we're getting a very, exactly what I was hoping for, a diverse range of values, objectives, priorities, and I'm really looking forward to how we'll start integrating that into phase 3, and how we collect that information, process it, and then begin building a strategic vision out of that. As I mentioned, I have my hands full, and N3B has their hands full with the cleanup mission. We asked one of N3B's critical subs, Long and Eckert Associates, to help us with this, and they've been a great help, successful so far, and they've reached out to that broad set of groups to get the engagement, and we've had a pretty good response overall. I'm looking to for a couple last engagements. We're working hard to build a connection, if you will, to engage with organizations in Rio Arriba County, Espanola. In fact, just last night, I spoke to the city council in Espanola about the strategic vision, what we're doing. I'm hopeful that I shared that information with the council members, as well as members of the public that were there, in the hopes that some of them might be interested, because that's a community that is affected down, the watershed down gradient, that I would really like to hear their voices. And it's also a great opportunity to share what we're doing, address any issues, concerns, and fears that they have, but also try to engage them in this process so that they can give us inputs and values and priorities, because they have an opinion, they have a perspective, and it's important for them to have their voice heard. Again, I'm not forcing them to the table, but that's a group that we've been focusing on recently to try to see if there's any interest and generate some interest and engagement. And we're going to continue this effort to engage with additional groups as we go through the process. Obviously, when I get to phase 3 and I'm starting to assemble and the computer model, the computer code that we're having together to bring all the data together and weight it and process it with us, at some point there I'll have to cut off bringing more data, because at some point you got to stop getting data and start doing the work. But until I get to that point in phase 3 where I just can't bring additional people into this, we're going to continue to outreach and work with folks. So what are we doing different? You hear this from the environmental justice engagement listening sessions that we have. The strategic vision is an example of what are we going to do differently. I mentioned changing the cooperative agreements with the Pueblos. I talked about working with Taos Hive. working with the Santa Fe Indian School. The strategic vision is another example of what are we going to do differently, because, and I know I've shared this with you all before, but please let me be a broken record. Maybe there might be somebody in the public listening today that hasn't heard it before, but the federal government will typically put these plans together. Ourselves, we'll optimize it based on cost and schedule and whatever other factors are important to the government, roll it out to y'all and ask you to tell us what a great job we've done. But what we're doing differently here is engaging first. And I think this is a somewhat of a parallel to the expectation of consultation for the Pueblos, where they want to be informed before the Department of Energy makes a decision so that they have an opportunity for their voice to be heard. So we're doing the same thing differently here. What are we doing different under environmental justice? We're giving people a voice as we go back and build a strategic plan on how we're going to do the cleanup mission here in Los Alamos. And then from that strategic vision, when it finally comes out of the last phase of this, my corporate partners will build a 5-year work plan so that we're not just working year by year or 2 or 3 years ahead. We have all kinds of plans that show here's how we're going to do the cleanup currently, but out of this strategic vision, it will change some things. Some of the end states, some of the cap and cover end states that we previously assumed will get revisited based on what we hear for the values and the objectives and the priorities. And if those change, we'll be building a 5-year work plan that we update every year. So I call that a rolling plan because it rolls every year as you execute the current year. At the end of that year, a new year is added to the 5-year plan. So I always have a 5-year planning. This gives me some stability because now I'm not at behest or beholden to my operating contractors. I was asked at a session recently, so how does this endure beyond me personally leading this or my contractor? Because we change contractors when the contracts end sometimes. How does that live beyond it? A 5-year rolling plan will extend beyond the contract period and gives the incoming contractor, it's kind of a constraint. This is the plan. Now we don't go reinvent the wheel every time the one contract expires and we bring in another contractor, because a lot of the contractors will compete by coming up with the next great solution or bright idea. And this isn't rocket science. This is go define a plan and go execute it. So that's what I had to share with you today regarding the Chromium intermeasure, where we are with the Justice 40 and how we're continuing to engage in the listening sessions and actually delivering on some justice that we're hearing from these listening sessions and the strategic vision. And I'll just finish with the strategic vision. I'll tell you, this is, I said it was going to be exciting up front. Now I'm going through it. I'll also add it's exhausting because it takes a lot of energy to engage with these folks, and it takes alligator skin sometimes to listen to the difficult messages that are passed by, but that's part of the community engagement. And this strategic vision, the community engagement that's coming out of it, the constructive, the positive feedback and the constructive criticism that comes out of this gives me a lot of personal satisfaction as the field office manager. And I just kind of wanted to end that update with that point. And Madam Chair, I'm sorry, I know I blew the schedule on that, but I can answer questions or we can move on as the CAB sees fit.
Thank you, Michael, for all the information you provided. We are currently behind schedule. I see we do have questions from Jim, Mark, and Steven, but I wanted for us to break for now. And if you could hold your questions, we will return at 2:45 for public comment. Thank you, Lee, for bringing us back all to the table. I had asked Manise, and she said we currently do not have anybody signed up for public comment, but I wanted to open up to our visitors online and in person. Was there anybody who wished to speak during the public comment?
Yes, Madam Chair, I would.
You may proceed, Scott.
Thank you. Thank you. I wasn't sure how to log in here. I did have a question. Is today's CAB meeting open to the public in person? Just, you can answer that later.
Can you repeat the question? I didn't hear you.
I'm sorry. Is today's CAB meeting open to the public in person? I mean, could I have come down there?
So right now, Scott, we're still with the COVID, the respiratory issue, and flu season, we're still doing the hybrid. We'll look as we move farther into this season, and we look at the CDC numbers to maybe getting a little broader audience.
Thank you. I appreciate that. My name is Scott Kovac. I'm with Nuclear Watch New Mexico here in Santa Fe. I wanted to thank Michael and Rick Sheen for their discussion and trying to clear up this pump and treat issue and this injection. Michael, you are supposed to be overseeing the laboratory, the contractor at the laboratory, the cleanup contractor. So I appreciate that, and I do think that we need to try to be a little bit more steadfast in our oversight of the contractor. Thank you. And then I wanted to thank Elena and Mark for their work on the recommendations. I mean, is there another remedy option other than pump and treat? I mean, that we could possibly look at here, and I don't think so. I think it's always probably been that the final remedy would be pump and treat. And having said that, it's been 20 years since the plume was discovered. And, it just seems to me that, 20 years later, we still don't have the boundary of the plume. And it seems to me like if pump and treat was, if we were probably heading towards pump and treat, and it's not good to inject, water, treated water into a plume, then, maybe we should have spent a little more time looking for the boundary of the plume. I mean, they estimate 160,000 pounds of chromium were placed, into the canyon, into Upper Sandia Canyon, and some portion of that has made its way down to the area of the plume. But I just think that the time that has gone by, makes it harder to realize. I'm sorry, makes it harder to realize, what to do. But I think we need to focus. I mean, we should know the plume boundary by now, I believe. And once again, thanks to everyone. And that's all I have today.
Thank you, Scott, for your comment. If there are no other...
I would like to make a comment.
Hello.
Okay, hi.
Yes, you may proceed. What is your name?
Okay, I'm John Tokes. I am an environmental engineer, rad waste person up in Los Alamos. And I was curious if NNMCAB might be able to provide an update to the CAB and to the public on the status of the 33 true waste shafts at MDAG and what the plan is to deal with those. One of them has mixed true waste in it, and I imagine the state would have input on that one. And so I'm curious if an update can be provided either briefly now or in a future CAB meeting on the path forward for the 33 true waste shafts. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for the comment. We will take that under advisement. Are there any further, is there anybody further that would like to speak on public comment? And if not, thank you very much. I would ask that those joining online and by phone, if you could mute your lines And with that, we will go back up to the previous item from update and look ahead from N3B with Bradley Smith. Bradley, are you online?
Can you hear me, Madam Chair?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, thank you. I have dual duty. I'm using a phone and looking on the WebEx. So good afternoon. Northern New Mexico Citizens Advisory Board. I'm Brad Smith. I am the current acting executive officer for N3B. Those that remember Joe Laguerre, he is now with Newport News, working corporately, and I have been asked to help out and step into his chair. So I look forward to meeting you in the future. Apologies. So let me start with N3B continues to achieve DOE's goals for the cleanup program. We are currently the EMLA contractor charged with leading the cleanup activities at LAML. On April 29th, 2023, upcoming, will mark our 5th year of work at Los Alamos as the cleanup contractor, so our employees are quite excited about that. And along with that, N3B was recently notified that DOE will exercise the first option period under our contract, which is a 3-year agreement that will take us through April 2026. And we're excited to continue our work and to build on the successes to date. With that, I'd like to continue on and remind our focus areas of work so that as that reminder, it becomes second nature to us all. And we have 3 primary overlapping areas. First, protecting water quality. Second, cleaning up the land. And third, shipping waste off site. And when it comes to protecting water quality for us, that includes both surface and groundwater. Its goal is to meet applicable standards and ensure water supplies remain protective of human and environmental health. Secondly, cleaning up the land, which includes remediating our surface soils, and that comes under our aggregate area program and ensures long-term protection of former waste disposal sites, which were known as material disposal areas. And thirdly, shipping waste off-site. So we package and ship off-site contaminated soils and waste. That includes true waste to ship, but also low-level and mixed low-level waste to private disposal sites that we have contracts with. And I'd like to frame these comments that follow within this cleanup framework. So within protecting water quality, drinking water supplies in the Rio Grande remain protected. Michael did an excellent job with the hexavalent chrome, so in the interest of time, I'd like to just provide a quick status that we have completed R76 well pad. We are mobilizing the R77 pad location and pad construction, and these actions and others support further characterization of the chromium plume. And we are currently supporting DOE EMLA and discussions with NMED, and Michael described that. Moving on to stormwater monitoring under the permit. The public comment period for the individual permit sampling implementation plan concluded on February 18th of 2023. And EMLA and N3B have 45 days to respond to comments and submit the sampling implementation plan to the EPA. So that is good news. Next, under cleaning up the land, we continue to remove contamination, thereby protecting water quality and human and ecological receptors while planning remedies at the material disposal areas. I'd like to mention at first MDAH. We're emphasizing the proposed cleanup plan or corrective measures evaluation under the 2016 consent order. That will be submitted to NMED no later than September 30th of this year. MDAH is a small site, approximately 0.3 of an acre, but presents challenges due to the high explosives contained therein, and the waste may also be sensitive to various elements, including sparks, friction, physical impact, air, and moisture. So as we continue to develop the CME, we want to hear from you. Michael talked about outreach and stakeholder engagement. This allows your values and priorities to be heard and considered, and also helps us to learn what you believe should be considered as part of our evaluation. The public meetings will include the Citizens Advisory Board, which we're here, and we will brief you at the April meeting and look forward to your recommendation, as well as the Environmental Management Cleanup Forum, which is scheduled for April 12th of 2023, and I'll talk a little bit more of that at the end. Material Disposal Area L, we have completed the vapor sampling. We will soon issue the vapor sampling and soil vapor extraction report. And moving on to Middle DP Road, we've shipped 216 of 331 waste containers. Looking forward, we're going to continue excavating and performing the extent of condition sampling, shipping waste off-site. And as part of our extent of condition sampling, we have found lead and arsenic and continue to characterize the rest of the site. Regards to aggregate areas, the program continues to achieve the goals, and we're going to address waste volumes coming up in the next piece on shipping waste off-site. But I'd like to update on 2 Mile Canyon aggregate area. We've completed investigative sampling of for 17 out of the 61 sites, with 965 of the 2,518 planned samples collected to date. In the lower water aggregate area, NMED approved our responses to their comments on the investigation report. No further field work is required. And finally, on Starmer Upper Pajarito Canyon aggregate area, through February 15th of this year, 386 samples have been collected, and the sampling collection is approximately 11% complete. Moving to the final area of our campaign, shipping waste off-site, we continue to ship waste off the hill. We're exceeding EMLA's goals while expanding true waste remediation efforts at both corrugated metal pipes, drill and drain. Successes in FY23 through March 5th of this year, we've had 211 shipments totaling 2,400 cubic meters, approximately equivalent to 11,543 55-gallon drums. So trying to give some context on how much waste is gone. Our true waste shipments to WIP, we have a goal of 40 shipments this year. It's a 33% increase from the fiscal year 22 goals. From contract start, we have 142 WIP shipments, and thus far through March 5th, we have 36 of the 40 shipments complete, which totals approximately 68 cubic meters of waste. Regarding low-level and mixed low-level waste, we're continuing to ship that. Through March 5th, we have 168 shipments, totaling approximately 2,260 cubic meters, or equivalent to 10,875 55-gallon drums. And most of this waste is from the aggregate area program in Middle DP Road. So in the interest, or in the context of cleaning up the land, we wanted to provide that, and we're looking forward to continuing shipping waste off in the weeks and months ahead. Glove bag drill and drain, we've been using new processing lines. We were previously unacceptable shipment due to the liquids and prohibited items in the drums. So basically this is a drum punch, and we have one processing line that includes use of glove bags to sort prohibited items currently in the drums. Actually, I think the way this is written is slightly backwards. We are using drill and drain, but we are going to shift to glove bag. Originally, our assumption was with our drill and drain, we could get approximately 2 drums per day through the line. However, we have found through the characterization some increased liquids. And in order to meet the WIP WAC, we have to ensure that that liquid is removed. So we're developing a shaker table. So if you go to Home Depot or Lowe's and you see kind of a little turntable that they put the paint on, this has a very gentle pace, and that force, that subtle force, actually helps to drain the liquid out of the container. So while we are installing that, we are going to go to the glove bag processing, because while it's manual, we have one cleanup crew that is very good at doing that. So we're going to shift to that and then come back to that campaign later on the drill and drain. We have approximately, through the drill and drain processing line, though, we have nearly 1,500 drums of waste that's processed for shipment. So that is a good news story. And lastly, our corrugated metal pipes at TA54. Just as a reminder, there are 158 of these what we call CMPs, corrugated metal pipes containing cemented radioactive liquid waste. The project is retrieving the pipes, reducing as far as size reduction, so we put them in a shear, cut them up, and then put them into standard waste boxes for shipment to WIP or a low-level waste repository, depending on how the characterization is conducted and what we find. Currently, N3B is in a stop work action as of last Saturday. On March 9th, EMLA identified completed actions for correct safety issues from January 25th stop work that we did not comply with OSHA standards. Therefore, our current stop work is based on additional questions from EMLA regarding the compliance with the OSHA regulatory requirements and appropriate engineering standards, focusing on the slope angles of the pit where the CMPs themselves are located. We're addressing these matters right now, and to ensure worker protection, we're conducting a series of fact findings and bringing in subject matter expertise to help oversee and provide input into where we are going on our corrective action plan, and we will provide a status update to you later. And engagement remains central to our decision making. So we have a consent order public meeting on March 29th. NMED and EMLA is hosting a public meeting to review fiscal year 23 milestones and targets. Denise will send the Citizens Advisory Board the meeting information. And secondly, the Environmental Management Cleanup Forum I mentioned a little earlier, April 12th, mark your calendars, 5:30 to 7:30 p.m., Santa Fe Convention Center, and it will also be a hybrid, so we will have virtual capability. And the focus of that meeting will be on material disposal area H, corrective measure evaluation. And that sums up at a high level. Any questions I'm willing to take, and thank you for your time.
So Brad, we had a question online from Siona Bradley with NMED about which technical area the shaker table is going into. So Brad, you can add to this, but it'll be technical area 54, one of the domes, and we will do a permit mod to add that equipment to the to that particular TA. So
correct. Yeah, it's actually in Dome 231 is where that will go.
Do we have any questions for Brad? Okay. If we have no questions, thank you very much, Brad. Bradley Smith, Acting Director in 3B. We'll now move on to an update from NMED with Rick Cheyenne, Chief Hazardous Waste Bureau. Rick?
Yes, good afternoon again. I'm trying to get my camera started. If you can't see me. This is going to be a high-level update on both LANL operations oversight and WIP oversight. This time, some of this may have already just been mentioned, but here's from our perspective. Over the course of several meetings between DOE and NMED, during the last few months, we finally got a final FY23 appendices A, B, and C for the consent order, and they were finalized and submitted on February 21. Task identified were 14 milestones in Appendix A, 14 milestones, 22 targets for 2024, and 13 targets for year 2025. The drilling issues with R73 have an impact on the schedule of milestones and targets, and of course associated with the Chromium IM campaign. NMED is hoping DOE will be able to catch up next year on the drilling of these wells. These updated appendices are on the NMED website. And as was mentioned earlier, on March 29th, NMED will host a public meeting where LANL will present its FY22 accomplishments and FY23 milestones from 5:30 p.m. to 7 at the City of Gold Hotel. That will be the in-person, but this is a hybrid meeting, and we encourage all the CAB members to attend as best as you can. And for more information, you can go to the public notice or meeting notice on the NMED website. Getting to the groundwater, because of the drilling issues, R73 will be plugged and abandoned. DOE is hiring new drillers to plug and abandon this well.
It's a setback for the CMI, but as we mentioned, we hope they catch up over the next year. The Chromium intermeasures and characterization work plan are currently under review. Some notes for February 23rd. NNMCAB and LANL have met for a pre-submittal meeting for the interim facility-wide groundwater monitoring plan for year 2024. And the department has approved it with modifications, a drilling work plan. R25, an old West Bay well with multiple screens, has finally been plugged and abandoned, and NNMCAB is waiting for the final P&A report. Also, we've reviewed a periodic monitoring report for the base flow monitoring for the sites MDAB, AB, TA21, TA16, 260 monitor, and the 260 monitoring groups. Jumping to Middle DP Road site contamination, DOE is still conducting the field investigations and collecting confirmatory samples, and we're just waiting for the completion of the field work and the submission of the final report. Jumping to the MDAC corrective measures evaluation, on March 7th, DOE submitted a notification to NNMCAB stating that they were deferring the CME for MDAC to use MDAC site as a laydown yard for national security operations. On March 10th, NNMCAB responded with a denial on this request because we don't see it as fitting the definition of a deferred site under the consent order. Status of the site is there currently a hazardous and radioactive waste buried at the site, and there's also a subsurface VOC groundwater plume below it. We have concerns about allowing any disturbance of the existing soil cover due to the increased traffic and the laydown and the operations they plan for that parcel. In addition, the site is currently fenced and not accessible to the public. As far as I can jump the other LANL permit related activities. Renewal application was submitted in 2020. We have sent 2 administratively incomplete determinations to the Department of Energy. We've met several times to resolve comments, and currently we're waiting for DOE to submit a revised application that includes an additional storage unit. DOE has submitted a Class 2 permit mod for the addition of a new hazardous waste management unit at TA60. They did this on March 13th. We're currently reviewing the request, but we will host a public virtual meeting on April 19th to go over this. And again, if you want more information, please look at the NNMCAB website. Jumping to a WIP update, with regards to the WIP permit renewal, we approved a 60-day comment period extension request, and the new deadline is now 5 p.m. on April 19th, 2023. Negotiations are currently planned for around in the July timeframe, and we believe the public hearing currently is planned for September of this year. SIMCO, the new acronym and a new co-permittee at WIP, we approved a permit notification on January 30th for the change in the operational control from the Nuclear Waste Partnership to the Salado Isolation Mining Contractor, or SIMCO. WIP shipments, as of January 1st through March 13th, there have been a total of 78 shipments received at WIP. This includes 57 from Idaho, 12 from Los Alamos, 4 from Oak Ridge, and 5 for the Savannah River site. And that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Any questions for Rick?
I have a question. This is Stuart. First of all, although I am the chief naysayer around here, I really support NNMCAB's positions against LANL and WIP and DOE in general. So I'm still focused on the chromium plume. It appears to me that EMLA and NNMCAB are looking at the same data and interpreting it differently. The EM sites around the country Many of them are also involved in dealing with chromium plumes. Clearly, the substructure or the underground treatment at Los Alamos is quite different from those. But I wonder if a way to break this loggerhead between your department and EMLA is in fact for you all to visit, if you haven't, some of these sites, like at Hanover, to see what is being done there, how successful it is, what the solutions for dispersal of this water, and that seems to be the sticking point now. As you've said yourself, the issue is what do you do with the treated water? So I wonder if that's a way that you two organizations can move forward to find some solution, because I think this is really time sensitive. I know Michael and Lee and others in the room live in LA, so I would suggest that the top members in NNMCAB move to LA and drink the water and see how long it takes you to get to crisis management. I also don't see any crisis management in plan. Once the plume reaches the Canary and the coal mine well that's by the domestic water well for Los Alamos, that's only a signal that it's there, folks, stop drinking the water. And unless you all have figured out how to do an ice dam like they did in Japan, I don't see any way to stop the plume. So that's my comment.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Stuart, for that.
Thank you, Rick. We have a question, Mark?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is for Rick. I think Michael Michelanis was very frank with us on talking about the chrome plume and what they've done, what they plan to do, and strategic plans and whatnot. But what I wanted to hear from NMED is we have a buffer now, we have a stop work. We're also about to enter in 2 months the monsoon season. And with reference to the sky falling, is there any concern about the monsoon and the migration, or are we fairly safe?
Thank you for that question. As far as timing goes, we see where the plume is located in the distance. One, knowledge I don't have offhand. I'm sure the modelers have to use it as the groundwater flow velocity. Two, with respect to monsoons, my assumptions you're referring to maybe some infiltration and pushing of. Given the depth of where the plume is now, I don't know if there's a direct contact between, or I don't know how long it takes for water to infiltrate. Given the depth and other places I'm familiar with in New Mexico, it could be years based on where it is, and based on if it's down in Arroyo, it could be days. It does depend on what the geologic setting is, certainly. As far as crisis management goes, I don't know the exact time when there was a release of the chromium, what happened, but we can see at least how far the plume would move based on when the release, maybe over the last 50, 60, 70, 80 years. We've seen the distance that we're aware of at this point. It's not moving 10, 20 feet a day or 100 feet a day, certainly. But given what we do know about it and how it is moving, I'm not concerned over the immediate future. But just like everybody, I would like an interim measure. I would like a final remedy to put in place sooner than later. Maybe not exact your emergency question or the what that probably doesn't address you immediately, but at least says for what we need, final remedy as soon as possible.
Thank you for your questions. And Stephen, did you have a question or not for, okay.
Madam Chair, not for Rick.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. With that, if we have no further, do we have any questions from any of the members online? If we have no questions, we'll move on to the next item on the agenda, which would be what does risk mean in environmental remediation with Erich Everett. And if you're in person, it is we have his biography in the blue piece of paper. And with that, Erich.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you.
The CAB members had asked for a briefing on the conduct of risk assessment in Los Alamos cleanup, and Patricia Wald-Hopkins will be delivering that presentation in just a moment. That was originally scheduled for the January board meeting that you recall got canceled due to weather and road conditions, and so she's teed up and anxious to share this with you. In a couple of the subcommittee meetings last month, it became clear that there is in general some confusion over what risk means. And to help put Patricia's presentation in context and help clarify what we mean by risk, the committee said it would be a good idea to have at least a brief coverage of that today. I'm happy to do that. So in a sense, I'm the opening act for Patricia. She's the main attraction. Risk drives cleanup decisions, priorities, and actions. Next slide, please, Bridget. But the word risk can mean different things depending upon the context, all related to environmental remediation. There are 8 types of risk that I'm going to quickly share with you. Next slide. The first 2 are human health risk and ecological risk. That's exactly what Patricia is going to discuss with you in a moment. And these are risks to people and the environment due to the presence, the depth, the nature, and the amount of hazardous waste or contaminants at a site. We analyze risk for each solid waste management unit or area of concern, each site. So there's more than a couple thousand of them at Los Alamos. So a lot of risk assessments are performed. We assess them to assess the risk to determine whether a site needs to be cleaned up and by how much. And then after we've done the cleanup, we assess it again to make sure that the risk-based cleanup goals are met. Risks so in order to analyze that risk, you have to have done your sampling and characterization of the site. You cannot know what risk a site presents without that characterization. For human health risk, as Patricia will cover in detail, those calculations are based on future use scenarios for that site, residential, industrial, construction, or recreational. So that's human health and ecological risk. The third risk is radiological risk, which is a parallel assessment that we do for the risks to the health of humans because of the presence of radiological contaminants. Human health and ecological risk was for hazardous waste, and radiological risk is for that, the radiological contaminants. And there the principal concern is the health effect to a human based on exposure to that radiation, and that's measured as latent cancer occurrence later in life as a result of that exposure. And we're talking about the increase in the risk of cancer to that person by as little as 1/100,000th, 1 times 10 to the minus 5, or that person's population's lifetime, or 1 times 10 to the minus 6, 1 in a million for a cancer death. So morbidity is the occurrence of cancer. Mortality is death by cancer as a result of a radiological exposure, even years ago, from the contaminant that they've been exposed to. So there are models used to analyze this. ResRad is the most common one used to determine these, and it's a standard process across all radiological risk assessments. Next slide, please. The fourth risk, and isn't one that necessarily is discussed much, but the political or perception risk to the Department of Energy in failing to adequately embrace the values and priorities that matter to you, to the stakeholders. And EMLA's initiative in the strategic vision engagement process, with which this board is quite familiar, is directly aimed at addressing that risk, that we proceed in the program without adequately addressing the concerns of the public and stakeholders at large, pueblos, local governments, advocacy groups, all manner of those who have a stake in the cleanup. The next risk is a programmatic risk, and that, again, it can be a subtle one and not necessarily visible or in the minds of everyone thinking about this, but it has to do with risks to the cost and size and duration of the cleanup program based on what we don't know. If you have a good understanding of the contamination in one area, say an aggregate area of soil contamination, and as a result, a general idea of what the cost is going to be and how long it will take to clean it up. But in this other tract, you don't have that information. Not having that information represents a risk to your program's cost and duration. So you might elevate that latter one in priority to address it, to characterize it, so you can help deal with that uncertainty risk. So in terms of the overall program, sometimes you'll go after something that you don't know enough about to do it before that which you know a good deal about, because you have confidence in its cost. That's a programmatic risk I wanted to share. The other is something that was touched on, I think, by Michael, and that is when you lay out the forecast of a cleanup program's cost and schedule, when cleanup decisions for individual sites are yet to be made, you have to make planning assumptions of what that will be in order to estimate cost and time. DOE has done that and has for years. They have assumed certain approaches in order to lay out the lifetime baseline budget and helps justify congressional budget requests, appropriations requests. It could well be that your assumptions prove not to be correct, that the ultimate cleanup decisions that are made could be something else that would have an impact on the duration and cost of the cleanup. That could happen. So that's a programmatic risk. You're not certain how much the program is going to cost because decisions have yet to be made. And they are not yours necessarily to make, which is the case for DOE and NMED. NMED will make the final decisions on those cleanups, not DOE, as Michael has said. All right, the next risk is the body of, next slide, please. Thank you, Bridget. Safety and health risks, and there's a broad range of these, but it's the risks to the workers, to the public, and then transportation accident risks that are associated with the conduct of any particular remediation project or its approach. And those have to be taken into account in planning the project. So that's in the case of workers, it's excavation, construction and deconstruction, heavy equipment operation, materials handling, and potential exposure to hazardous or radioactive waste. For the public, it could be a potential airborne release of contaminants during excavation of waste or soil. And of course, transportation accident risks would be associated with hauling large quantities of dirt and materials to or from the site, and then empty trucks making the return trip. So those are risks that have to be taken into account in cleanup decision-making and planning. Project risks are rigorously identified, and we do our best to prevent them or mitigate their impact within the context of a specific cleanup project. And if those risks are realized, which means they actually do occur, they have an impact, a cost and schedule impact on the project. Some examples of our experience here. A downhole drilling obstruction. When we were drilling well R69 3, 4, 5 years ago, we hit a boulder, and it diverted the drill bit and unacceptably altered the course of the borehole, and we had to abandon that hole and restart the drilling. And it was several hundred feet down already at that point. So it became a cost and a time impact to the project. But there's no way to know that boulder was there. We're talking several hundred feet down, and there's not uniform boulders across there. You just don't know. So it's a risk that you have to identify and think about and be prepared to deal with, but you can't prevent it. So it's an accepted risk, and it can have an impact on the cost of the project. Another potential project risk is a greater volume of contaminated soil or a higher level of radiological contamination than you had planned for based on the information you had available. We have seen that as well. In the cleanup of the known cleanup sites back a few years ago, we found there's a great deal more contamination we had to remove than was apparent in the documentation available at the time. So these things do happen. Project managers plan for them and deal with it. But that's another important area of risk in the conversation is the project risk. And then enterprise risk. These risks are those that not always a very high likelihood of occurrence, but could have a major impact on either the contractor or the cleanup program or DOE as a whole, And the classic example there is the whip drum incident. Who knew that that kind of thing would happen? But it did, and it delayed transuranic waste disposal and whip operations by 3 years, cost the department and the taxpayer billions of dollars to deal with. A major enterprise risk, unpredictable at the time. There are some other risk categories that might be in that category: a major safety incident, a major security or cybersecurity incident, or a major shift in national priorities might alter the course of a cleanup program. Don't know. But so there's those high levels of risk that we put in the category of enterprise risk. So those are the 8 areas of risk I wanted to lay out to help this board understand that the specific human health and ecological risk assessments that we do are in that context. They're a category of risk. But to generalize that is the entirety of the risk would not be accurate. Madam Chairman, I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the board? Roger?
Yeah, I'm thinking about the term pay me now or pay me later. When they talk about cap and cover to minimize risk and expense, it seems to me like the incident on DP Road is an example of cap and cover, where somebody threw a bunch of radioactive waste and then covered it up, and nobody had to deal with it until they started digging trenches to put in utilities. So my thought or my question about cap and cover is, how long is this data maintained that there is a risk that has been capped and covered in case there's future development or projects that would incur that hazard to be uncovered again? So I'm wondering about, well, do you take the time and the risk and the expense to take care of it once and for all, as opposed to leaving it for a future generation or something to that effect? I don't know if I summarized that very well.
I understand. It's a very good question and a valid one. The long-term stewardship for a facility that has been dealt with through that kind of engineered approach to confinement of the waste as opposed to the removal of the waste requires some kind of institutional control or protection of the site, depending on whether it will be in public access or not. There's a body of expertise and plans within the Department of Energy generally on how to deal with sites like that. And so that would be included in an approach that would leave the waste on site. But it's a reasonable question. Thank you.
Thank you. Mark?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is for Mr. Everett. If you can maybe comment on a risk that wasn't mentioned, and that's COVID-19 as a pandemic to everyone. Was that a delay risk looking back? Are we behind in our cleanup operations? Did we save any money during that period of time? And in your opinion, or in the government's eye, is the pandemic over?
I cannot speak. I'm going to take those in roughly reverse order. I cannot and will not attempt to speak for the government with regard to whether the pandemic is over. I have a personal opinion on the matter, not appropriate to share, but I cannot speak for the department. As to whether there was an impact by the COVID pandemic on the progress of cleanup, sure, absolutely. We had inefficiencies introduced. We were blocked from conducting certain work. We chose to shut down the Chromium interim measure for a short time, as you know, because of the inability to conduct that without personal involvement of the technicians. And there was other cleanup work that didn't proceed. But frankly, field work was some of the least problematic because those workers were not in close proximity with other humans, and so we continued with some field work. But no doubt there was an impact. Did we save money as a result? I don't think so. We deferred some costs. You know, the work will continue. The work will be done at the cost it will cost, whether it was done in 2020 or will be done in 2025. Did I cover all the items? Did I miss one?
I didn't hear whether the pandemic is over.
You're right, you didn't.
Stuart?
Yes, in doing research down at the incredible library that CAB maintains, I just happened to read this huge volume that had to do with MDAH and the consent order in 2016. I'm not sure why we're having this conversation, because a consent order gives NNMCAB authority over any of the CMEs that EMLA or DOE proposes. So they, in fact, are the final arbiter of what qualifying risk and what level of risk is willing to be. Within that discussion of the MDAH, it lists the CME development criteria. The threshold criteria is protects human health and the environment. That's only one of 5. Achieves media cleanup objectives, controls the source of releases, complies with applicable standards for management of waste. So we're having all this discussion around risk management, but that seems to only be one aspect of developing a corrective measures evaluation. So who decides, one, within the risk itself, what of those issues you posted on the screen, which is most important? How is that weighted? Who is making that decision? That's what we're concerned with. Now, and is there some kind of weighting? In this study, these things were weighted. They were given a numerical order, but no explanation of who created that weighting or how it was derived. Now, in the end, it says, however, DOE will seek a remedy that can be implemented quickly and easily, poses fewer and less significant difficulties, is cost efficient, and does not sacrifice protection of human health and environment. In other words, in the end, the Secretary of DOE is going to make the decision regardless of what any of us think. And that's really disturbing to us. Now, sitting over on your side of the table or in your seat, I don't know how you gain consensus among even the people in this room, let alone people in Rio Arriba County, Los Alamos County, Santa Fe, what risk is and what is an acceptable risk. And like Roger says, you know, Jim and I in our 80s would say, fine, just get us down the road the next couple of years without blowing us up. But I got grandkids, you know, so whether you leave that stuff in place, what the risk is to leaving it in place or digging up, and MEDAH is a perfect example of that. How do we know that that's going to be safe 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 100 years from now, 10,000 years from now, if you leave it in place? So there's a huge community, a huge cohort there that blows all this way and says, I don't care what the risk is to the people that work at the lab. I don't care what the risk is to the people who live in Los Alamos. I don't care what the risk is to N3B workers. Get it out of there. That's your job. And protect the rest of the world from whatever was put in the ground by us in 1945 to 1950. So I'm done.
Stuart, I'm sorry, Stuart, Sterling?
Sorry, unless I heard wrong, Brad Smith informed me just today that there have been 2 stop work orders on N3B this quarter. 2 stop workers in 1 quarter? And that's an acceptable way for a contractor to operate? I don't know who can answer that.
So let me try to unpack both those. I'd like to go back to Stuart's, some of what Stuart said, and I'd like to clarify a couple things for you, Stuart, because some of what you said warrants a little clarification. But let me go back to the last question. The Department of Energy did not impose 2 stop works upon N3B, because if I, as the senior federal official, under our we have a directive called Order 425.1 that addresses requirements for readiness, and in an event that the Department of Energy, a senior official, management official, directs a shutdown of a facility for safety concerns, that requires a readiness assessment. That's a significant bit of activity. That would not happen in a quarter. So, as Brad mentioned, in January, when N3B was preparing to resume work in the excavation, one of my facility reps was walking down the site, raised some questions and concerns, and asked for the work to be paused. That's a way that triggers a, hey, let's stamp. We don't have to go into formal stop work at that point. A worker can do that on the floor. If the worker says, I'm not comfortable, we didn't necessarily go over this in a pre-brief, I'd like to pause the work. Any worker, whether it's contractor or federal, can ask for a pause, and we are trained to give that pause, because it's better to pause and take a step back, make sure everybody's on the same page. Department of Energy asked for a pause in January, and after N3B looked at the concerns that my facility representative raised, and that's a facility representative, for those of you who don't know, are the operations oversight. They're my eyes and ears in the workplace, on the deck plate, day in and day out, watching the work being done. They have the procedures in their hand at times. They're watching procedural compliance, things like that. So as N3B looked at that, they stepped back and said, yep, we see some things that need to be issued. They issued a stop work on themselves. So yes, they stopped work at that point to go put a remedy in place. As the contractor then went through the corrective actions and resumed and began startup, we were looking at those corrective actions, and we had additional questions. And as a result of those questions, they chose to enter another stop work as a result of that. Neither time did the Department of Energy have to issue a stop work, but I would agree with you. No, that is not acceptable performance for my cleanup contractor. And if my counterpart, Kim Liebeck or Brad, were here, in fact, I've met with them. What's today? Today's Tuesday, and they felt the same way. They are not happy with their company's performance. That's why they put a stop work in place. If you recall, I was here as well in last October. My corporate partners saw a number of lower level issues that were emerging, and they took a site-wide pause of work, a stop work that lasted almost 6 weeks. So I'm pleased with that kind of proactive behavior when they recognize it themselves, and they are not happy with their own performance at this point. I will invite Brad, if he's still online, to chime in after I'm done. But I am also even more disappointed that the Department of Energy has to raise these concerns, and their contractor assurance system is not self-identifying it. I am continuing to have discussions with N3B's leadership, and since I'm still in the middle of that, I probably shouldn't go into any more detail on that while I'm working out and they're working out their own corrective actions. And under the department's directives, we have a directive called 226.1 that addresses contractor assurance systems. It sets up an expectation for a governance model. The Department of Energy does not staff up to actually be responsible for every piece of the work that's going on. The contractor is. They need to have the systems, the mechanisms, the functions in place to provide assurance of safety and to manage the risks and assure worker safety. And when the contractor assurance system has a problem, it can be even so far as a systematic breakdown. I'm not at the point of saying this is a systematic breakdown, but the Department of Energy finding these issues and raising them raises serious questions that I'm dealing with the contractor on. And that's probably about as far as I should go, because we're still working it with them.
I failed to mention that the reason for my concern is that just recently, and I'm sorry, I don't know the origin of this news release to the Santa Fe New Mexican, but somebody revealed that N3B, the contractor that's had 2 stop work orders in 1 quarter, got tens of millions of dollars in bonuses from the Department of Energy for excellent work. Now, you know, I don't know about you, but that seems bizarre to me.
Well,
Thank you.
The time that you were talking about that was in the New Mexican was for performance in 2022. The 2-stop work in fiscal year 2022, which ended in September of last year. We could have a quite a lengthy discussion on fee and contractor performance and how that's being done. But under the contract that we have with our contractors, we negotiate when we bring them on a fee pool for them to earn. Some of that's subjective. If they provide specific deliverables that are specified, they earn that fee. A portion of that is subjective. That's where, when I hold my corporate partners accountable for performance or reward good performance, the dial that I have a lot of control over as the fee determining official is evaluating their subjective performance. Things like this weigh into subjective performance. The things we're talking about now, these will be factors that are considered in the fee determination for 2023 and contract performance in 2023. And you know, if fee awarding or withholding was based on just number of mistakes and errors, a lot of what we do is human, and it's got backups and layers upon layers of defense. I absolutely expect that there will be operational upsets. And as I evaluate performance, it's not just whether an operational upset occurred, but it's also a matter of how did the contractor own it? Did the contractor own it? Did they simply check boxes through and get back into operations and not explore the causes and put comprehensive corrective actions in place? Those are the things that I evaluate. And when the contractor owns it, they drive solutions, they get back to work in a safe manner, and they prevent recurrence. Those are things that can mitigate the operational upset in the first place. It's a very complicated process, and frankly, one of the biggest learning hurdles I had before I came over and became the field office manager, because the decisions of a fee determining official are pretty significant. I'd like to go back to some of the things that, did I answer your question, sir, before? I want to go back to some of the things, Stuart, that you brought up. One of them that was resonating and with me, and how's the risk determined in the scenario you brought up, and the Secretary of Energy determining the risk based on some of the factors. I'll tell you, the Secretary of Energy does not determine or accept the risk or say what level of risk is acceptable for a cleanup project in any of the environmental management. I'll speak for the EM scope of work. What the Secretary of Energy does do in the role of risk acceptance is he or she approves the directives that describe and establish the methods and the processes that we use. And those are requirements down to guides, and usually the secretary is in charge of the policy, and then the direct reports to the secretary work the orders and the manuals. There's only, I think, 1 or 2 manuals left in the system that contain requirements on how we go do that. So the secretary's role is primarily in establishing processes or defining what limits. Since we are our own self-regulating agency, the secretary, in putting the 10 CFR 851, the worker protection rule in place, identified OSHA standards and other standards that the Department of Energy will comply with. So that's the secretary's role in the risk acceptance process. My role as a field office manager, if I have the safety authorities delegated to me, which I do, is the risk accepting official. So I'm the official for the secretary on the floor that accepts or not accepts risk. Let's talk about a hypothetical amount of waste that's buried in a material disposal area. My contractor's role in evaluating the risk, much like what you heard here just a few minutes ago, is in performing the calculations, doing the risk acceptance calculations that use the industry standard processes. One of those, for example, is in the context that you brought up. Okay, so what's the risk in 100 years, 1,000 years, 2,000 years if we leave the waste entombed versus pulling it up? There's a standard industry practice of looking at the fate and transport of contaminants underground. There are industry standards computer codes that are used. GoldSim, I think, is one of those, and ResRad's another. If it's a radiological contaminant, once you understand the subsoil and subsurface conditions, that calculate it out to years and hundreds of years, thousands of years, whatever the regulatory compliance limit is. And then there's the state playing in all this, because while the Department of Energy sets its processes up, points to the industry or other agency limits like EPA would establish or OSHA, and then we do our calculations and comply with. And as we develop this corrective measures evaluation, we'll look at ranges from doing nothing at all to putting cap and cover to full retrieval, maybe targeted retrieval. The corrective measures evaluation looks at all the options, brings the impacts to those, and then makes a recommendation to the regulator, who then makes the decision. So you could argue the final risk determiner is the regulator, because in this case, NMED regulates our environmental risk when we propose closure of items under RCRA. If for items that are under DOE's own regulatory authority, then we would be applying our own directives and standards. I am not empowered to go make up my own standards. In fact, if I want to deviate from the Secretary's directives, there is a directive on directives that tells me how I have to go about to get an exemption or a waiver from the requirements the Secretary has put in place. And I'll tell you that is a very high hurdle to jump over. So field office managers like myself, we go implement the Secretary's directive system, the risk guides and limits that have been established for the department. We task our contractors to do the calculations and analyses, present it to the risk determining official. In this case, I will have a hand in the corrective measures that is sent to the state, but then ultimately, in this case, the state will weigh the merits of our arguments and make a decision. And I cannot and will not try to speculate on how they do their process. But I hope that clarified a little bit, Stuart. It's not as wild, wild west that where Katie bar the door, anything can happen. I have very strict, I have good guidelines that are guardrails to what I can do. I do have some discretion as a risk accepting official, but it is not anything I want to go do. I hope that clarified.
Yeah, well, the consent order specifically says or references NMED's, quote, risk assessment guidance for site investigation remediation. So that seems to govern what you do, and the intent, from what I read from the consent order, is the baseline is you're supposed to dig it all up and get it all out of there. And if you don't want to do that, that's impractical, too dangerous, whatever, then you prepare what you're talking about, corrective measures evaluation. You look at alternative things. You submit that to NMED, gain their approval or don't, and go forward. But again, it seems like this whole idea of risk assessment, it starts with NMED, and it's whatever their standards are that we're all being governed by then.
Go ahead.
If I may, Madam Chairman, that is correct. And you're going to hear a great deal of detail about that from Patricia in just a moment. Yeah, one clarification, if I may. The corrective measures evaluation process applies to the 7 material disposal areas identified in the campaigns of the consent order, plus the 2 groundwater projects. A very large portion of our cleanup work is not among those. The aggregate area soils cleanup program, which Patricia will touch on, is driven by the risk-based cleanup guidelines from NMED as driven through the consent order. So absolutely, you will see that in action. One other clarification, if I may, just before I forget it. Rick Sheehan, in his comments, I think misspoke when he said about MDAC, that there is a VOC plume in the groundwater underneath there. That is not the case. It is in the subsurface, but it's many hundreds of feet above the groundwater. It's in the pore space of the rock. Didn't want to have a lasting misimpression about groundwater contamination there.
Yeah, if I may speak to it, Erich, Madam Chair, if that's okay. This is Neelam Dewan from NMED. Rick did misspeak. It's actually in the subsurface, and that was our concern why we did not want MDAC to be used for other activities. It's right now fenced, it's enclosed, And we will not allow, it's a landfill, which has an existing cover, given it's not an engineered cover yet. So we would not allow that to endanger anybody.
Thank you, Neelam. I have one quick comment. With the risk, one of the big factors is also the funding, what can be funded for the project. Because I am here because I grew up with a uranium disposal cell, a cap and cover, where I grew up, and the big reason that was not removed was because of the cost. So, and there's also we have several uranium disposal cells where I live, and we also have the area where I grew up is actually where they mined the uranium. They produced the yellow cake, and it was brought here. So that is how I am here today. But I am really rooting for you to be able to solve this, because I'm hoping with that information I can go back to my own community and we can address that also. So I am really hoping that you can do this. We can find a solution to this, because it's not only Los Alamos, it's also all the other communities that will benefit from this, for your dedication, and also the staff here. So, and Michael?
I appreciate that comment, and I'd like to share a story I heard recently, or a value, and that was shared recently in a phase 2 session. I'm really interested in how this will all percolate its way through into phase 3. But as we were engaging with a group recently, there was an interesting a concept I wanted to share with you, and that was the concept of financial responsibility. The department has a responsibility to manage the taxpayers' funds in a responsible manner. But it's not as simple as just managing the taxpayers' funds in a responsible manner, because you have to balance the financial responsibility you have with an ethical responsibility. The ethical responsibility we put the waste in the ground in the first place decades ago. What are you going to do about it? And I would add, in the context of this discussion, it didn't come up in the phase 2 feedback they were listening to, but I think you could add a third. Imagine that as a seesaw around a pivot. Where do you find that balance point? It'll be an interesting thing but that sounded like it might be one of the inputs into the guiding principles as we put this together. Imagine now a 3-dimensional seesaw where you're not just pivoting on 2, but the third one of risk responsibility, because the Department of Energy, and I know, Stuart, you've said that it's the department's responsibility to go manage the worker risk, but that's another responsibility that the department has, is to manage worker risk, public risk, environmental risk. So imagine as a 3-dimensional teeter-totter. The third leg I just put onto that myself, not what I heard in the phase 2 feedback session. But this is, I wanted to share that little anecdote with you, because the ethical and financial responsibility balance was an interesting concept, and building upon that for here, this has given me a lot to think about. And frankly, I share it as here's the value, an example of the value of the strategic vision process and why we're engaging with these different groups to think about and build this into our strategic vision. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Michael and Erich. We're a little bit behind schedule, so we will move on to Patricia Wald-Hopkins with Overview Environmental Risk Assessment, and hers is the purple biography. Patricia, I turn the time over to you.
Thank you. Oh boy, okay. So, more details, right? I am the Human Health and Ecological Risk Assessor with N3B Los Alamos, and I have been, working up in Los Alamos with environmental remediation in different capacities since I got out of graduate school. And so I've seen a lot of things change over time, and I am from New Mexico, so I've seen a lot of things change over time here. But today, what I'm going to talk about is, it says overview of environmental risk assessment, but if you see those pictures there, those are really specific to Los Alamos, to the area, to Lanel. And I'm not going to talk about MDAs today, or groundwater, or surface water. I'm going to focus on the soils, the aggregate area, because they have a good process for risk assessment, which is based on NMED guidance, which is based on EPA guidance. And so I'm going to talk about that today and kind of give you a context for how we do things. Okay, next slide. I will go ahead and we're going to talk a little bit about what goes into the human health and ecological risk assessments. Let's see where I want to look. I'm going to look over there if I can see. And we're going to talk about the receptors. So the different, sounds funny to say the different humans, but the different scenarios that humans could be exposed to chemicals during their life, and as well as ecological receptors. We'll be talking about the target risk levels that we use to determine if the concentrations in the soil are potentially posing a risk to the health of those receptors, which are developed not here. The human health comes from the Environmental Protection Agency, and for the RADs, for radionuclides, those come from the DOE guidance, Order 458.1. So we'll be talking a little bit more about those. We'll also talk about how important it is to have good data, environmental data. I don't go out and do the field work. I have done that in the past. When I was younger, I did go collect a lot of environmental data. But it has to be the way that it's the sample designs and all of that I'm not going to talk about today, but there is a process for that before we get the data to do our risk assessment process. So we end up with these exposure point concentrations that we enter into our risk assessment to determine if we have an issue. So go ahead and next slide. Let me take a drink of water. Okay. I'm going to begin with the EPA definition of environmental risk. And theirs is broader than what I'm going to focus on today, but it talks about harmful effects to human health or ecological systems resulting from exposure to an environmental stressor. So there are various kinds of stressors. There are physical, stressors like drought, right? We're not going to talk about that today necessarily. Chemical stressors, that's what we're going to talk about. And there's also, biological stressors, like you may have seen with the drought, the bark beetles, pretty much took out a lot of our junipers and the piñons. So we're going to talk about the specific risk to humans, plants, and animals today, first from soils. We're not going to talk about any of those broader natural stressors, okay? All right, am I putting you to sleep yet? No, it's been a long afternoon, so I'll try not to bore you too much here with all this text. I'll just kind of talk from it. The human health process, we look at what the nature and probability is of adverse health effects to humans, and we will look at different scenarios. Like I mentioned, we use the residential scenario, and we have a recreational scenario, an industrial scenario, and a construction worker-based scenario. And all of these are models. They're not probabilistic models like you were talking about earlier, but they're deterministic models that are used to figure out how much chemical would get a person would be exposed to if they were living on the land, and perhaps they, were gardening or, digging in the soil, or if it was, was in the subsurface and it came up into the house, through volatilization, or it was dusty and you inhaled. Those are all the things that go into these models, and we didn't develop those. Those are from the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and NMED has a soil screening guidance that is based on that we use. For ecological risk, we also follow EPA guidance and NMED's guidance as well, because our ecosystem is rather unique in many ways. Not me, but LANL as an entity over the last 3 decades or so has developed a conceptual model that fits the canyon mesa top ecosystem, because we're dealing with, you know, 1,000-foot in difference in gradient, and the receptors that we have in those canyons, as you know, they're beautiful. They're filled with beautiful animals and plants. So we have a process that we've made very much more specific to what might be listed in the NMED guidance. Next slide. So why are we doing this? This is what we've been talking about, the remediation piece. We want to have a tool that has been, you know, tested and vetted on many levels that will tell us if we need to clean up the environment so that it is at an acceptable level based on these standards that EPA has developed, or the DOE has developed. We want to be able to do this because LANL is so large and there's so many sites, so many SHMUs and solid waste management units and areas of concern. We need to have a process that is repeatable and that is, you know, standardized so that we're looking at everything in the same level of detail, in the same manner. And of course, a site might require that we do something a little bit, you know, different to address what's there, but we have this repeatable process to go ahead and generate these risk estimates across this huge facility. And why we do this, we gather all this information together. We generate these reports called investigation reports, and they have all of the data in them from the field investigations, and the appendix, which is the risk appendix, which is what I focus on. And it's filled with all of the information, all the calculations, all of the recommendations and conclusions that are drawn from the risk assessment process. And those are what you see come out into the public for review as well. For example, like the Chiquehue investigation report, or you know, Pueblo Canyon. You've probably seen Water Canyon, North Ancho Canyon, Upper Pajarito Canyon. You know, all of the different canyons and all the aggregate areas that are within those. Okay. So we have three main steps that we use for both human health and ecological risk. And the first step is, like I said, is very important to identify what chemicals are at the site. And so you might think that we would have a set list for LANL, but it does vary. And so we have to determine which ones are actually present at each of those sites. And we do that with statistical methods, background comparisons. And we also have to develop the site conceptual model. We have a large one for the whole LANL facility, but within each aggregate area and each SHMU, you have to develop a more specific one so that you make sure where you took your environmental data is going to address whether it's in the media that are potentially contaminated, that could potentially expose people now or in the future. And then the third step is we have to make sure that the data that we collected from all these different media, today we're focusing on soil, that we have a representative number, an exposure point concentration that is representative of what a human or an animal or plant might be exposed to. And those are called exposure point concentrations. And we use an EPA methodology where we look at the 95% upper confidence limit of the data set for each of those chemicals. And some sites, have hundreds of chemicals, so you can imagine the amount of data that is generated and needs to be carefully managed through this whole process. And so it's it might seem like it's just a plug and chug, but it's not that. It's a careful paying attention to every little step, every little detail as it goes into the, as you progress forward in the assessment. And the final piece is the uncertainty analysis. And, that touches on, you might show at a site that there was a risk to, let's say, I'm just going to pick ecological receptors because I was a wildlife toxicologist for a while. But you see a number on a paper, but you go out to the site and you look at it and you don't see anything that looks like there's overt toxicity or anything like that. So you have to consider that as a line of evidence in your uncertainty. Or you look at the bioavailability of metals, and perhaps out there the metal is in a form that is just not bioavailable, and you might not see that when you compare just the straight concentration of the chemical to the risk threshold. So there's a lot of other uncertainties too, and I might touch on some of those as we go forward, but go ahead. Oh, I have 2 glasses of water. Thank you, whoever brought me another one. Okay, now we're going to talk about the receptors. Again, I've mentioned it, and the target risk levels. So let's see what's most important here. We pick the receptors and the target risk levels to identify if there's risk to current and reasonably foreseeable land use. So you might have a site, that's going to be behind the fence probably indefinitely, and you wouldn't expect a recreational user to be there. And you also know that the residential scenario is more conservative, and it would be protective if there ever was, for some reason, a recreational user on the site. And so you don't have to use every single human health receptor at every single site. But we always use the residential as the most conservative base risk assessment, just in case there's any question. And for the ecological risk, because there's not, we have birds, mammals, amphibians, insects, worms, trees, shrubs, bushes, we have to identify representative species or feeding guilds that we look at to assess risk. And we also have to make sure that we take care of the threatened and endangered species, like the Mexican spotted owl, which has a lot of habitat up there. And so we need to make sure that we're protecting those species as well. Next slide. So for human health, the target risk levels that we look at based on our guidance from NNMCAB and EPA, Erich touched on these before. We look at 1 × 10⁻⁵ excess cancer risk in your lifetime for the population, for the carcinogens, and for the non-carcinogens, those are the ones that we look at the hazard index of 1, and I'll talk a little bit more about what those mean and how they're used. And then the dose limit for radiation, for radionuclides, is 25 millirems per year. And that comes from the DOE order 458.1. And for ecological, the ecological is a little bit different. They're not currently assessed under the DOE 458.1. We do look at radionuclides within the ecological risk, but it's not based on cancer. We don't look at cancer risks for ecological receptors. We look at this population risk and what is going to make the population level decline. So we look at reproduction and development success, and the rates of mortality, growth, and so we don't have a dose for ecological receptors. We just have a target risk level for systemic toxicity. And next slide. Now we're going to talk about the details for the human health risk assessment. As I talked about before, we have different scenarios, and there's potential for the receptors, the humans that are in these scenarios, to come into contact with different layers of soil. And for the resident and for the construction worker, we look at a larger depth interval of 0 to 10 feet. And the reason that we do that is because there's a high likelihood that they could build something on the land, dig into the ground, and be exposed to whatever is in those layers. And these, again, are based on EPA NMED guidance. The industrial and recreational, we only look at the 0 to 1 foot depth interval. And the reason we do that is because it's not anticipated that they would be in contact with anything deeper when they're out, walking or hiking. I mean, they could. Someone could sit and dig a hole, I suppose, but that would be covered under the residential. So we always look at the residential as well. So the soil screening levels for we already talked about those ones. I'm not going to go over the soil screening levels for the non-RADs are called SSLs. You might hear that thrown out there in this presentation, while the screening levels for RAD are soil action levels, or cells. And those are all going to be, it's milligrams per kilogram for the non-RADs, and it's picocuries per gram for the radionuclide soil screening levels. Okay. Yep. Did it show? It's not showing the next slide for some reason. Oh, you guys are lucky. That's the Wait, you can look at your handout if you want me to keep going. That's fine. I'm on page 13.
Yeah, so folks, it looks like the WebEx froze for Bridget, so if you have your packet, we'll continue on with the discussion.
I know it's small. It would have been okay. Actually, it should not be, not 13. Is it not coming up? We're back on. Okay, great. Perfect.
Could we ask a question while we're waiting?
Sure.
Hello, if we could you just continue, but then we can take the questions later, so that way we could get through all the content. We do have our presentations if you wanted to just, I believe we're on page 10.
Yeah.
Yes, you may proceed.
Okay. Let me find my page 10. So on slide or page 10, we're looking at the human health risk assessment, the generic site conceptual model that we use when we're setting up for a risk assessment for a site. And what we do with this is, if you'll see to the far left, we have to identify the contaminant source, and We'll need to then figure out the primary release mechanism. Is it going to be in the surface and or subsurface soil? Then we have to look at what secondary sources might be, surface water, release into deeper surface and subsurface soils or tuff, or volatilization into the air. Then we look at secondary release mechanisms, dust emissions, direct contact, uptake by biota, cattle grazing. And then we look at the exposure pathways that might be present. And those could be incidental contact or ingestion, inhalation, ingestion, dermal. We have beef on there because that addresses the, if the land is used to graze cattle. I have to put on my glasses, I can't see this very well. And, or inhalation. And so we have this model where we can go across to the right, and we have all the receptors there, the industrial, recreational, residential, construction, and biota. And in those little boxes there, we can put whether it's L for not low, low likelihood, M for medium likelihood, or, I believe we use, moderate likelihood, and not applicable for NA. And that's how we know where we need to make sure that we have enough data to be able to characterize that risk. And I don't have an example for you here today, but maybe I can think of something after I get through some of these other slides here. I didn't bring a slide with an example risk assessment because I think I was told to not do that, so that would just be too much. And as after we do the conceptual model, we're on slide 11 now, right? Is it back up? It's back up. Oh. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so, why does it feel like there's a slide missing? All right, I'll just go with it. The essential nutrients, we also look at an evaluation of that. That's like calcium or magnesium that are in the soils. They do actually have limits where they are toxic, so we have to address that. We will look at total petroleum hydrocarbons if they are found at the site, and also we look to see the site history to see what is expected at the site. So we would address those if we expected to see total petroleum hydrocarbons, make sure we do the right analyses. Dioxins, furans are another one of those that don't show up at all sites, but they do show up, and so we have to make sure that we know what was going on at the facility so that we can make sure that we have the data we need to characterize risk. We look at lead separately from the other non-carcinogens because the lead toxicity is based on a blood lead level rather than a systemic toxicity endpoint. And it's to protect, the EPA developed it, but it's to protect children who are exposed to low levels of lead and result in issues, neurological issues, as well as some other effects. And so we have to single it out and evaluate it separately. We also will look at vapor intrusion if that is a site that has a lot of volatile organic compounds. There's a guidance in the NMED soil screening guidance that characterizes what that would be, which are the VOCs. And so if we have those, then we have to evaluate it qualitatively or quantitatively, depending on what we're seeing there. And it's usually only an issue if there are buildings there or anticipated for buildings to be built. Next slide. Okay. Now we're going to move on to the ecological risk assessment. So shift gears a bit here. As I mentioned, we have a very unique habitat on that Pajarito Plateau. that goes all the way down to the Rio Grande, which is one of the many things that's so beautiful about New Mexico. And we developed a screening level ecological risk assessment guidance that is in agreement with the NMAD guidance. It's just made more specific for LANL. And we start out, and this is some of the work that I got to do, which has made me even appreciate some of the animals and plants on the site even more. We go do we call it an ecological scoping checklist. We have to go out to the site and we have to look at the whole ecosystem out there and see what's going on, kind of ground truth it to the conceptual model that we had. And then we take that information and we keep it because we're going to use it later. Then we go back and we have to calculate the risk using ecological screening levels with the soil data that we've obtained from the field work. And those are the EPCs. We use a data range of 0 to 6 feet. And that is to account for any, not only the animals that are on the surface, but those that might burrow, or the plant roots that go down. And some plant roots will go down deeper than 6 feet, but in general, plants, the more delicate plants that don't root as deep, they're actually more sensitive in general, more sensitive. And so the screening levels that we evaluate, the 0 to 6 feet, are protective in general. There might be some exceptions, so there's always can be exceptions with ecological situations. And now we're going to move on to the next slide. Again, you're going to see a conceptual model. It's very similar to the human health one. It has the, well, I can't, I don't know what I did with it. Doesn't matter. It has the same primary, the release source, the primary media of contamination, the mechanisms that it's going to move through the environment, how it's going to interact with all these different animals. And we have a generic plant that we look at. We use the earthworm as a generic receptor because it's very, it's very sensitive. We use a series of different bird receptors, the robin, the kestrel, and we also use a deer mouse and the rabbit. And there's a whole system that we use to evaluate which ones would be most protective and representative. And I'm not going to go into that today. You can read the soil screening guidance that we developed for doing risk assessments to find out those details. And then again, we will identify if it's likely, moderately likely, unlikely, or not applicable. And that's how we know we focus our risk assessment process. Next slide. And in addition to looking at the risk to the chemicals, we need to do this uncertainty analysis. And I mentioned before that we look at the chemical form. We need to look at the exposure assumptions. Is that really what's going on at the site? Again, we need to look at the toxicity values with ecological risk. While EPA does have a set of soil screening levels that they use for CERCLA, and they are adopted to be used within the RCRA remediation, there are not as wide a range of values available as there are for human health. And so we have to use a very structured process to go through and pick data from the literature. And, I spent a good 20 years trying to do that. So we have a lot of information, toxicity values that we need to make sure they are relevant? Are they the receptors that are used in the toxicity studies? Do they match? Are they more sensitive or not sensitive enough compared to what we're seeing at the site? And so we have to look at that information. We also, with ecological risk, I threw up these two area use factors and population area use factors because they're different than human health. And so you might have a deer mouse on a site, and it's not going to move very far. It's going to probably stay right on that site. But if you have the Mexican spotted owl, for instance, it might come into the site and forage and hunt for prey or whatever, and then it'll leave, right? So these factors account for that, the amount of time that it's actually on the site versus when it might be elsewhere. So they have a broader home range, and these take into account the receptors' home ranges. And then we also always have to look at what we don't have toxicity values for. We do that in human health too, and just make sure that we address it in an appropriate way. Next slide. And finally, using all of this information that we've collected, we need to develop our lines of evidence for why or why not there's risk. And then all this information will go into the risk appendix of the investigation reports for the aggregate areas. And that's next slide. Okay. All right, so in summary, what I presented to you today, hopefully in some coherent manner, was a standard framework for assessing risk to humans and the environment being the ecological receptors. This framework is prescribed and repeatable, but it is able to be modified to address site-specific issues. And if that is done, we always need to have concurrence with the regulator. And the risk assessment results that we get from this process will give us an idea of what the risk is at a site for both humans and ecological receptors, and tell us where we need to clean up, excavate the soil at these sites. So it's a really detailed process. Risk assessment is a very detail-oriented process, and like you talked about models, it's really important that the data that you put into it, that you have a high confidence in it, and we use the different guidances to make sure that we do have confidence in our data, and if we don't, then we have to go collect more. And that's all so that we can identify what needs to be cleaned up. And as I mentioned, this is for aggregate areas, soil remediation. This is what I presented to you today, but it does apply generally to other sites, other types of sites. And that is, I believe, thank you very much.
Thank you, Patricia, for the information. I know it's a lot to go over, but to be respectful of the time of our members and also those who have traveled, I'm going to ask that if you have any questions, that it be deferred to Manice, and she can get them to Patricia, and then she'll be able to answer and get back to you. We still have updates from our DDFO, and with that, Lee, I turn the time over to you.
Okay, I'll make this quick for everybody. So Manice sent out yesterday the Appendix B. Rick mentioned that. The Appendix B public meeting with MED is going to be on March 29th at Cities of Gold, and we will have that broadcast as a hybrid meeting as well. We'll go over the Appendix B, and Mark, you'll be really interested in this presentation because a lot of the questions you have in your recommendation, it'll actually cover, and it kind of breaks down the campaigns, how many SMOOS AOCs are per campaign, a lot of those, and which campaigns have CMEs and which ones don't. So we've got a lot of information built into it. So I think it'll check off a lot of the boxes from the recommendation you help develop. We've been talking to Manice on a couple issues. We have an electronic public reading room. So every time EM publishes a document, sends it to the state, we upload that to the electronic reading room. I don't want to be too bold and just put everybody's email and get you 2 or 3 emails a day of documents that are uploaded, but maybe Bridget can go kind of through the team and simple question, do you want to be automatically receive those? And it's a great way for you guys to keep up as things are happening, and you choose what you want to open up and look at. And so it's a lot of what Stuart's been looking at in the hard copy reading room. But every time we make an update, if you were on the list, you would get those, all those reports. And you'd also get a sense of how many documents Lee signs out every day. We followed the Fall Whip Trip is ongoing, so we got a couple seats left there. If you haven't let Bridget and Manice know that you want to go on that fall trip, please let them do that. We met with XCOM when we canceled the executive committee, when we canceled the January meeting because of road conditions. And so we are going to convert the April meeting into a full board meeting. And we'll be looking at MDAs during that board meeting. So we're going to kind of take that committee meeting. You guys can have your committee meetings, but the April timeframe, we're going to replace that January full board meeting back into the queue. So we get our 6 board meetings in for the year. We didn't want to lose that. Yeah, and we're going to talk to the acting whip manager, and he's going to give us an update as a second presentation there as well. There's a question in the chat earlier on recording these meetings. This meeting is the first meeting we did record. It should be uploaded to YouTube by Friday, and in the future, it'll be broadcast live, and then it'll be on YouTube. And Bridget, could you give us a brief update on the webpage where all those YouTube links will be? Bridget is now my project manager for the CAB webpage.
We have 2 staff members from SNK that are going to be redoing the webpage for the CAB. We have a August deadline, but we're pretty sure we'll be done a couple months before that. We are working a scoping plan right now to get hours and time and detail. We'll be also meeting with the Public Outreach Committee for the CAB pretty soon and going over the old website and figuring out what we're going to keep and what we're going to move over to the new website. So it's an ongoing project, and we're looking at hopefully July to have that up and running.
Okay, thank you, Bridget. So that was the long and the short of it. Any questions for me today on protocols? Sterling.
Lee, let's see. There's 3 things that I'd like you to, at some point, address. One of them is the power line. This is the 3rd time I've asked you for that, and that has to do with the National Nuclear Security Administration plans a new power line from essentially from Santa Fe to Los Alamos. It would cross the river in the Caja del Rio. And there's quite a bit of opposition to that, especially among the 4 pueblos who are supposedly our partners. So I'd like to know, and I looked in the environmental impact statement, and I couldn't find any reference to alternatives being looked at by NNSA. And the alternative, of course, that I'm interested in is not using fossil fuels to produce energy for making weapons. And then the second thing is I'm concerned, just from, and I know I'm uninformed because I read the newspaper, or I'm inappropriately informed because I read the newspaper. But this production of new pits for weapons, I assume, like all industrial operations, it's going to produce some waste. And I also was unable to find in the environmental impact statement where that waste is supposed to go. If it's going to WIP, I think it would be appropriate for this organization to know from DOE how is that placement of pit waste going to impact the available space at WIP for our waste, for legacy waste. So that's my concern about pit waste. And then I learned, much to my amazement, that there is something called Pit 38. Thank you, Erich, for enlightening me about that. But apparently, NNSA has said they're not going to dispose of any more waste on site. And the last disposal, get this, the last disposal of waste on site was 2017. So, I mean, it's just a knockout to me. It's just amazing. So anyway, I would just like I think the CAB would benefit from an update on NNSA's plans for disposal of waste.
So we have to couch that question very carefully, that as it affects EM. Because our charter's for EM, we're not a CAB for NNSA, so I have to couch that question carefully. Mark Bollinger will be here in April, either virtually or in person, acting WHIP manager, and that's a fair question. As far as the pit production itself, you're on the right track. The way you comment on that is you go to the EIS and you make public comments there, because we're not going to comment or make recommendations directly on NNSA's scope. That's out of our charter. So that's kind of our bumper on the side there. So as it affects EM waste placement at WHIP, that is I would say that is in scope. What are they doing at pit production? You work through the EIS. The same with the transmission line. That's NNSA's mission. You've done the research now. You found the EIS. It's open for public comment, and that's where. And I'll let you know, in EIS space, if you make a public comment, they have to put that in the comment response document. They have to document a response to your comment or you and your friends' comments. So those are those three items right there. Did that help?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so Pit 38, it was left open, and there's a clause in N3B's contract that if NNSA needs to put a special waste there, they can use that remaining space. To date, they have not used that remaining space. But what EM has done, to be very transparent, is we have excavated soils at places like TA21, and we need attic space. So we put the waste in the trench, containerized in the trench, and then there's a certain amount of fill that goes over the top cover that we call an operational cover before we have a final decision on MDAG. So we still want to operate and drive equipment up there and those types of things. So we have used excess soils from some of our other ER sites, not as waste, but as that attic fill, because our decision from an EM perspective is I could send it to an industrial landfill and pay to get rid of it, and then I could go down to Espanola and buy fresh fill and bring up the hill. So this is killing two birds with one stone type of situation, where if it meets the acceptance criteria at Area G and we can use it as attic fill, it seems to be a wise use of the taxpayers' money, that we're not buying, virgin soils or virgin fill from outside the county, bring that on board, and then shipping yet other trucks, putting them on the highway and disposing of it. So that's the kind of the quick picture of Pit 38, and we can certainly talk about that more in the future.
Thank you.
Yep. Jim?
Wrong button. Okay, here I go. Briefly, first of all, I want to apologize to the group for my rant earlier today. I have been, for a year on this committee, I've been wondering what the hell we do with all this. And because that's kind of my background, is you take stuff and you go do something with it. Well, what I heard today from Michael was that he's doing it all. And the forums that he's having. And I really appreciate that. And I finally realized, and Lee helped me in the hallway today, well, I finally realized I think I'm comforted by knowing the existence of this group and all the brains we have around this table exists so that we can reach the public more than we have been. And I think that's a never-ending objective that we have. But it sounds to me like we are getting closer and closer to reaching what I call the other half of the public. I mean, we can sell hats to each other in this room until the cows come home. But it's the uninitiated public that I'm as much concerned about as what we talk about here. So to the extent, Lee, thank you. I saw a comment on there that a minute ago that said, is the CAB going to be recorded? And this person who wrote that question said, I've been waiting 6 years for that. And so, let's go. Let's get it out there. You're getting closer, and it helps me feel better about why I'm here. So, thank you.
I appreciate that, Jim. Yes, sir.
And Jim, thank you for that feedback. Why are you here? The two recommendations today, I think, are excellent examples of what's your purpose and what are you doing. Granted, a lot of what Alina put into the Chromium recommendation, I'm doing, how much of that I need to sit down and look through it, but she did that independent of what I was doing. I have not shared the details of what we're doing with NMED and what our plans are and what we would like to do. So even if I'm doing everything that both those recommendations say, the fact that the CAB develops those independent of the inputs that we give, that's important because one, it gives one public input into what we're doing. And I know when we engage with our regulators, stakeholder, tribal, and that includes the CAB, input and feedback is important, and we share that with our regulators. And I would like to, whether it's news and recommendations that you think I want or don't want, I want the good, the bad, and the ugly, as I call it. And as far as recording, I was really glad to hear someone make a recommendation on that. I also heard a recommendation on that in our EM cleanup forums, and we're moving to record both of those because a lot of the dialogues, the public engagement, if you can't make an EM cleanup forum, if you can't make the time to come in a day to participate or observe in one of the CAB meetings, I want that online so that members of the public, it's an outreach opportunity. I want that put online for the Citizens Advisory Board website because I've seen that at other Citizens Advisory Board websites, and it's a powerful outreach tool. And I want the same thing for the outreach that we do for the field office in general to be recorded and available to the public, because I want the folks who are supportive, the folks who might have a different perception or a feeling about what the Office of Environmental Management is doing to be able to get to the information and then use that to engage in the future or to pass us feedback, whatever mechanisms are available. So I really appreciate your words of encouragement. I don't think I'm doing everything, my team, but we're trying to open up communications in a number of areas, reach out to communities that we don't think have had a voice if they want to engage and have a voice. So I really appreciate those words of encouragement from you and look forward to other words, encouraging or critical, in the future.
And our newest member, Stephen.
Thank you, Chair, members of the board, guests. This has been a very interesting afternoon for me. It's my first time around, so I appreciate your enlightenment as we went forward. I have a couple of quick questions that I hope are quick. They may have been asked before, but I'd like to ask them again. One is directed to Michael, and that is, first of all, would it be permissible? And second of all, would it be appropriate in terms of some of the meetings you've been having with respect to the tribes, to NMED and other stakeholders, for members of this committee, this board, to sit in on those as observers?
So let me break that down in parts. With the Pueblos, absolutely not, because the engagements that we have with the Pueblos are from a nation-to-nation perspective. Envision that as, you know, the President of the United States having a discussion with the head of France or the King of England now. The things that are shared, the dialogues that happen are diplomatic in nature, if you will, and frankly, when I do consultation or engagements with the Pueblos, part of the discussion is, okay, so what portion of the information or feedback is something I can carry outside the discussions? With respect to engagements with NMED and other organizations, I'll think about that a little bit, but if you want my initial reaction, the Citizens Advisory Board is an advisory board to the Department of Energy, and if I bring you into the sausage making, one of the concerns I have is that you'll start to lose your impartiality, because you'll start seeing what the department's doing on the inside, and the things that we need to bring to you are, we do this through the work plan, what are the topics and issues you want to look at? And then what kinds of questions or information do you feel you need to be able to look at for the work plan, I'll say, I would like the CAB's opinion, the CAB to look at X, Y, or Z and give me their thoughts on it. And part of the development of the work plan is, okay, so what information does the CAB think they need? Not specific documents or so, that's our role. But if I bring you too much into the meetings and the things that are happening in process, one, I don't know that my regulator would like that very well, because those discussions, there's a lot of sausage making going on. And two, I would have a concern with how that might impact the independence of the CAB itself. Those are just my initial reactions, but I'll think about that, Steve, a little bit. I've never been asked that question before.
And the last one, in terms of the pump and treat, when the water is in fact treated, is it safe to drink or not?
So all the water that goes, so we put it through a resin column that specifically pulls out the chrome 6, the hexavalent, which is the carcinogenic chrome. Chrome 3, excuse me, isn't very soluble. It's still down in the soils, and that's what's in your multivitamin. But yes, we do treat all the water to the drinking water standard. Good question. So, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Lee, for the update. And Stephen, throughout the year, we have opportunities to visit and tour the Lano sites, the different areas that we spoke about today. You'll have a chance to visit those, to also visit with the staff who work in those areas, and we'll have different guest speakers also coming in throughout the meetings. So you'll get a better understanding of what's occurring, as time moves on. And sometimes it's good to hear the presentation twice and then to see it, and then you get a better understanding of that. And with that, there are, especially from today, we've seen all the moving wheels that occur, the different aspects. And I wanted to put it out there to the board. Is there something else? Is there a presentation that you would like to hear that would help us better with dialogues or understanding any of the presentation material, or something you would just like to know more about? I'm putting this out for you. Mark?
Thank you, Madam Chair. We recently in the Consent Order Committee talked about different presentations, and I forwarded that to both Lee and Manise. But just so you know what they are, one is on the consent order, kind of a concise overview of what that is in maybe common language, because it's a lengthy document. Secondly is the Chrome plume updates whenever those are appropriate. Third, the Appendix A, B, and C, which I think Lee alluded to. There's another meeting that's coming up where that might be explained more. I'd like to attend that. And then overview of the WIP, I think, is already scheduled. So that we look forward to. And then finally, a little bit of oversight or formality of how do we move to have more oversight of the transuranic waste shipments to WIP from LANL as part of this CAB. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Patricia?
Thank you, Madam Chair, members. I did just have a couple recommendations, actually, to following up to environmental remediation and risk assessment. Being an active member of the community, farming, fishing, hunting, I'd actually like a follow-up on some of these flora, fauna. As some of our older CAB members may know, from about 2-3 years ago, we had a subject come up of eating or ingesting anything that is grown up on the hill. I was just wondering if there's been any further research on that, and also on any things such as animals, elk, deer. I know it's a very active hunting population up there. Has that been taken into consideration? And also kind of a follow-up on some of these soil chemistries. As me having a pre and post fire assessments during my graduate studies up in the Valles Calderas. I did pre and post fire assessments specifically on groundwater hydrology and soils. And I was just curious what the metals look like up there pre and post fire assessment, and if that had an increase in any of these plumes or environmental management cleanups, because I know some of that soil ended up getting baked down pretty good. There's a pretty hot, intense fire that was up there. Also got another one for the chromium plume as being an active member there in the area. Also, as some of you may have heard, we have the adamant regulations that have passed down in the Nambe-Poake-Tesuque Valley area. And we have what's being put up right now for the county is what we call a BDD sister station. So the county is installing a water treatment plant facility down in the San Alfonso area. And what they're doing is they're drilling down some vertical shafts down into the Rio Grande, and they actually purchased 4,000 acre feet of water rights that the county is planning on pumping from that aquifer, the deep aquifer. They went down 1,800 feet, and they're planning on using that water for the Nambe-Poake-Tesuque areas, as well as the citizens. So me, as a concerned citizen, I can honestly say there are concerns on whether we should connect to that system or not, being the fact that it's a vertical shaft right along the Rio Grande River. As we know, that contamination is migrating towards that San Alfonso boundary. And my concern is that as the county starts treating and pumping this system of that migrating plume going towards these deep aquifers, and these wells that are going to be used for these areas.
So, first of all, great questions. We did a presentation a few years back on, and I'll just say it, roadkill. And every time we hit a deer or animal up at Los Alamos, they do an evaluation, they do a biopsy, and they run the tests. And uptake in the wildlife is not really being detected right now, but we can certainly resurrect that. That's a fair question.
So I wish we recorded that.
And then that one may have been recorded. It's old and it's been several years. And we can do some more on the chrome plume, but we've done very specific testing of the aquifer under Los Alamos and the aquifer in Santa Fe County. And the Rio Grande is a barrier. The water chemistry is like a fingerprint, and the two water chemistries are so different. Those two aquifers do not mix. Rio Grande, you probably know this, that's really actually part of the Great Rift. That is actually tectonic plates. So those are two separate aquifers, but those are good questions, and we can re-review that with a presentation.
Great, thank you, Lee. Thank you, Chair, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Patricia. Stuart?
Kudos to Sherry Lynn to keep us on schedule, even though I'm disrupting that. Back to a question for Patricia. The thing that jumped out to me from your presentation was you were testing soil for residential and contractors 0 to 10 feet. I think that's worthless. Certainly, they're not doing any construction in Los Alamos that doesn't go down below 10 feet. I don't see how that applies to any of the MDAs. So it's more a presentation you would give to this room full of architects about dealing with hydrocarbon pollution, hydrotech, chloride, radon, stuff like this. I mean, we were talking about NDAH that goes down 60 feet. And so if you decide to dig out 60 feet around that, pour a barrier wall or something, those are going to be workmen. So I'm not sure how any of that applies to remediation of these hazardous waste sites at Los Alamos.
Thank you, Stuart, for your question. And it's very intensive because I actually took 3 courses of graduate level of this very topic. So it's like so huge. But yes, it is something, and I think Patricia can hopefully get back to you with the answer for that. Yes, and with that, I believe we have addressed all we needed to. Lee, I turn the time back over to you. Oh, do we have another question? Mark. Oh, Mark, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is, first off, thank you, Patricia, for your patience in delivering the presentation to us. We enjoyed it. The 2 questions I had written down for your response, because I didn't have a chance to ask because you were shoehorned in on a narrow spot, was number 1, there was a reference to a biokinetic model, and it really wasn't expounded on, so I'm curious to know what that is and why it fits under the human assessment. And then secondly, if you could give an example, which you didn't have, but one I would suggest is RDX. How is that assessed? Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for the question. And if you are attending in person, at the very bottom of your packet of papers is a mileage form. Please complete that and turn it into Bridget before you leave. And with that, Lee, I turn the time back over to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. With that, I officially adjourn this meeting. Travel safe, and we'll see you in April.